She smiled through it all. That was the part that broke him. Not the words, though the words were vicious enough to make a grown man's hands shake. Not the way his mother sat at the head of his table like a queen reclaiming a stolen throne. Not even the sound of shattering gold hitting the marble floor. The necklace Nia never took off, the one she'd worn every single day since her grandmother placed it around her neck at 17 years old. It was the smile. Quiet, controlled. The kind of smile a woman wears when she has practiced not crying in front of people who would enjoy her tears. Kang Min-jae stood motionless behind reinforced glass in the surveillance room beneath his own estate, watching his wife hold herself together while his family took her apart, piece by piece, word by word, and he felt something crack inside his chest that no enemy had ever managed to reach. He had survived bullets, betrayals, business wars fought across 3 continents. He had never survived watching someone protect him from people he should have already protected her from. If this story is already making you feel something, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single story. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if this one moves you, like it. Let's begin. The dinner had started the way all of them did when Min-jae was away. Quietly. Carefully. Like the first few minutes of a storm that hasn't decided how serious it wants to be. Nia had learned to read those silences over 18 months of marriage. She knew the difference between the silence of a room that had simply gone quiet and the silence of a room that was waiting, holding its breath, rehearsing, watching the door to see if the right person had truly left before it exhaled. This particular silence, the one that settled over the Kong estate's formal dining room at approximately 7:45 on a Thursday evening in November, was the second kind. She should have eaten in her studio. She knew that. She'd known it the moment she came downstairs and saw the seating arrangement had been changed. Her usual chair, the one directly beside where Min-jae sat at the head of the table, had been quietly relocated 3 seats down, replaced by an empty place setting that no one had bothered to explain. Small, deliberate. The kind of message that doesn't require words because the point is that you're supposed to feel it without anyone having to say it out loud. Nia sat down in the reassigned chair without comment. That was the part they never seemed to understand about her. They kept waiting for her to react, to push back, to raise her voice, to give them the dramatic confrontation they had clearly scripted in their heads. And every time she didn't, the disappointment on their faces was almost funny. Almost. Min-jae's mother, Kang Sun-hee, sat at the opposite end of the table in a dove-gray kipao that probably cost more than Nia's first car. She was 71 years old and moved through every room like she was waiting for someone to bow. She had never, in 18 months, addressed Nia by her name. Not once. She said the wife when she was being civil and other things when she wasn't. Tonight, she was not being civil. "You're wearing that again," Sun-hee said, not looking up from her soup. Nia glanced down at the dark green wrap dress she'd put on that morning. "I like this dress." "I'm sure you do." The table had 8 people at it that night. Min-jae's aunt, Ju-young, who was 2 years younger than Sun-hee and had perfected the particular art of agreeing with whoever held the most power in a room. His cousin, Park Hyun-woo, who at 34 had still not built anything of his own and compensated for it by tearing down everything that belonged to other people. 2 senior household staff who had been with the family for over a decade, and 3 other relatives whose names Nia still sometimes confused, not because she hadn't tried to learn them, but because they had never once offered any version of warmth that might have made the learning stick. "Min-jae's flight departs at 9, Hyun-woo said, pouring himself more wine than the glass was designed to hold. "He'll be in the air by now." It wasn't said to anyone in particular. It didn't need to be. Nia picked up her chopsticks and focused on the food in front of her. Japchae, glass noodles with vegetables. The kitchen staff had learned within the first month of her arrival that she genuinely loved Korean food, not performatively, not as a diplomatic gesture toward her husband's culture, but because she actually loved it. She had grown up in Chicago eating her grandmother's cooking, and there was something about the balance of flavors, the careful attention to texture, that reminded her of standing in her grandmother's kitchen on South Wabash Avenue at 9 years old, stirring something she didn't yet have a name for. She was thinking about that kitchen, the yellow curtains, the cracked linoleum her grandmother always meant to replace, when Sun-hee spoke again. "The wife doesn't know how to hold chopsticks correctly." Nia didn't look up. She did in fact know how to hold chopsticks correctly. She had been holding them correctly for the better part of a year, but pointing that out would require engaging, and engaging was what they wanted. "Mother," said Ju Young softly, in the tone of a woman performing concern without actually feeling it. "I'm just observing," Sun Hee said. "It's a simple observation." Hyunwoo leaned back in his chair and looked at Nia with the expression of someone who has decided in advance that they won't like what they're looking at. He had that quality, a kind of preloaded contempt that didn't really have anything to do with the person in front of him. Nia had designed enough buildings to understand structural flaws. Hyunwoo's contempt was structural. It was in the foundation. "Did Min-jae tell you how long he'll be in Singapore?" he asked her. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Depends on the negotiations. He swirled his wine. "And what will you do with yourself for 3 weeks? Sketch buildings no one's going to build?" The table didn't go quiet. That was the thing. Nobody flinched. The 3 distant relatives kept eating. Ju Young rearranged something on her plate. The staff near the door became very interested in the wallpaper. "I have a project," Nia said evenly. "A community center in Rainier Valley. They're breaking ground in March." "Oh, how civic of you." Hyunwoo smiled in the way people smile when they're saying something they've rehearsed. "The Mafia Boss's wife, designing community centers for, what's the demographic?" "Families." She met his eyes. "Children, mostly." "Right." He nodded slowly, like she'd said something amusing. "Very touching." Nia put her chopsticks down, correctly placed, resting across the bowl, and reached for her water glass. Her hand was steady. She made sure of that. She had learned, long before she ever set foot in Seattle, that there is a specific kind of person who monitors the hands of people they're trying to unsettle. Steady hands are a statement. She'd learned that from her grandmother, too. The rest of the meal passed in the particular way that bad dinners pass. Too slowly to be survived without noticing every minute, too quietly to be mistaken for peace. By the time the plates were cleared, Nia had decided she would go to the winter garden, which was technically her favorite room in the house, and also, for exactly that reason, the one place in the estate where she allowed herself to not perform. She didn't make it there alone. She heard the footsteps behind her before she reached the glass corridor. 2 sets, then 3. She kept walking. She counted the steps from the dining room to the garden, the way she used to count things as a kid when the world felt unstable. 31 steps. She'd counted them 100 times. She made it to 22 before Sun Hee's voice stopped her. "Naya." First name. That was new. It landed with the specific weight of something designed to land hard. Being called by your name by someone who has refused to use it for 18 months isn't warmth. It's a weapon. Nia turned around slowly. Sun Hee stood in the corridor with Hyunwoo behind her and Ju Young slightly to the side, positioned the way people position themselves when they have rehearsed a conversation. In Sun Hee's hand was a document, white paper. Several pages, folded with a precise vertical crease that told Nia someone had planned to present it this way. Folded, formal, final. "There's something we need to discuss," Sun Hee said. "All right. Sit down." "I'd rather stand." Something moved through Sun Hee's expression, a flicker of surprise, quickly buried. She had expected, Nia understood, the same compliance she always encountered. The stillness, the polite deflection. What she hadn't recalculated for was the difference between a woman who is quiet because she is weak and a woman who is quiet because she is choosing her battles. Sun Hee unfolded the document. "This is a confidential agreement," she said, "prepared by the family's legal team. It concerns the dissolution of your marriage to Min-jae and the terms of a settlement that I think you will find no." The word was small, simple. Nia said it the same way she'd say no to the wrong tile choice in a client meeting. Calm, final, not a discussion opener. Sun Hee blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said no." Nia didn't raise her voice. She had learned somewhere between her first architecture project and her grandmother's funeral that the quieter you are when you mean something, the louder it actually lands. "I'm not signing anything, tonight or any other night." Hyunwoo made a sound, halfway between a laugh and something colder. "You don't understand what you're refusing." "I understand exactly what I'm refusing." "Min-jae is not here," Sun Hee said, and her voice had changed. It had dropped the veneer of formality and found something underneath that was harder and less patient. "He will be gone for 3 weeks. Certain things are being reorganized during his absence. The agreement is, Mrs. Kang. Nia looked directly at her mother-in-law for the first time since the corridor. Min Jae and I are married. That is not something you can reorganize while he's on a plane. The silence that followed was different from the dinner silence. This one had a texture to it, something coiled and tightening. And then Hyun-woo moved. He moved past his aunt, past his mother, toward Nia with the casual confidence of someone who has never once had to account for his own movements in this house. And he reached for the thin gold chain at Nia's throat. The necklace was small, delicate, an oval locket on a fine chain that had been resoldered once, repaired twice, and clasped and unclasped by Nia's grandmother's arthritic fingers every single morning for the last 11 years of her life. It had been given to Nia at her grandmother's bedside 3 days before she died. Nia had not taken it off since. She took one step back. She was not fast enough. The chain snapped. The sound it made was not loud. In a room with marble floors and a glass ceiling overhead, it was almost nothing. A small metallic tick, the kind of sound you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. Nia was paying attention. She had been paying attention to that necklace every day for 6 years. It hit the floor. The locket opened when it landed. She knew without looking that the photograph inside, her grandmother at 40, standing in front of the house on South Wabash, squinting into the sun, had just been exposed to the cold marble of the Kong Estate's winter corridor. Hyun-woo looked at the necklace on the floor, then back at Nia. "Accident," he said. It wasn't an accident. They all knew it wasn't an accident. But the word hung in the air anyway, holding its shape, waiting for someone to challenge it. Nia looked at the necklace on the floor for a long moment. She thought about picking it up. She thought about what she would say. She thought about her grandmother, who had survived things that made this hallway feel like nothing, actual things, hard things, the kind of things that leave marks you carry in your body for the rest of your life. And she thought about what her grandmother would say if she could see her right now. "Don't let them see it, baby. The second you cry in front of people like that, you give them something they'll never give back." Nia crouched down, carefully. She picked up the necklace. She closed the locket and held it in her palm for a moment before she straightened back up. When she turned to face them again, her expression was exactly the same as it had been when she came downstairs for dinner. Calm, composed, present. "Good night," she said, and she walked away. She made it to the winter garden. She closed the glass door behind her. She crossed to the far corner where the tall Japanese maples her grandmother would have loved blocked the view from the corridor, and she pressed her back against the rough stone of the garden wall and finally, carefully, let herself breathe. The tears came the way they always came when she was alone. Not dramatically, not in the way people cry in movies, but quietly, slowly, like something reluctant to admit it exists. She pressed the locket against her chest and looked up at the November sky through the garden's glass ceiling, gray clouds breaking apart over the Seattle lights. And she whispered something to herself, or maybe to the woman in the photograph, or maybe to no one at all. "I'm not going to tell him." Her voice was barely above a breath. She wasn't performing for anyone. There were no cameras in this corner of the garden. She had checked, a long time ago, not out of paranoia, but out of the simple and reasonable need of a woman living in a house that didn't fully belong to her, to know where she was and wasn't being watched. She pressed the broken chain between her palms. "He doesn't need this. He doesn't need to choose between me and—" She stopped, swallowed. "He has enough. He carries enough." She tilted her head back against the stone and closed her eyes. "I'm not going to be the reason he turns on his own family." The words settled into the cold air of the winter garden and disappeared. She didn't know she was wrong about the cameras. She had checked the obvious places, the obvious angles. The small secondary unit mounted behind the northeast maple, the one that fed directly to the private security monitoring station on sub-level 2. The one that Min Jae had installed himself during the renovation 18 months ago, the unit whose existence appeared on no household diagram or security briefing. That one she had missed. Below the estate, behind reinforced glass, in a room that smelled like cold air conditioning and cigarette smoke from the guard who worked the night rotation, a man who was supposed to be on a plane to Singapore stood completely still and watched his wife hold a broken necklace against her chest and whisper that she would rather quietly suffer than give him one more burden to carry. Kang Min-jae did not move for a very long time. He had been standing in that room since just after 7 o'clock. His flight had been canceled at 6:43. A credible threat against the aircraft had come through channels he trusted, and his security chief, Park Sung-il, had pulled him off the tarmac before the information could spread. The protocol was standard: return to the estate through the concealed corridor, minimize exposure, assess the threat from a secure location before making any decisions about visibility. He had been watching the estate feeds for routine confirmation, 30 minutes of footage to verify the household was stable, nothing more. He had not been able to look away for 2.5 hours. He watched his mother hand his wife a divorce document. He watched his cousin move through the corridor with the easy arrogance of someone who has rehearsed authority in borrowed rooms. He watched the necklace. He knew about the necklace. Nia had told him about her grandmother and the necklace within the first 3 months of their relationship, back when they were still figuring out what they were to each other. He watched it hit the floor, and he watched his wife pick it up with steady hands and walk away without a word and find the one corner of his garden that felt safe to her and whisper that she was protecting him. His phone was in his hand. He had picked it up, he realized, at some point. He wasn't sure when. His thumb was hovering over Sung-il's contact. He put the phone down. He stood in the cold blue light of the security monitors and looked at the footage of his wife sitting in the corner of the winter garden with her knees pulled up and the broken necklace in her palm. And he understood something that he could not have articulated at 42 years old if anyone had asked him before tonight. He understood the difference between a person who stays with you because they have no other option and a person who stays with you because they have made a specific choice every single day, even on the days when the choosing costs them something. His mother had called Nia temporary. She had called her a woman who would never carry the family's bloodline. She had handed her a dissolution agreement in his own corridor, while his wife smiled and stayed quiet and protected him from a conversation he never should have needed protection from because he should have made this impossible long before tonight. Min-jae picked his phone back up. He looked at the screen for a moment. Then he put it away again, very slowly, with the deliberate care of a man deciding that whatever comes next is not going to be done through a phone call. He looked at the feeds one more time. In the winter garden, Nia had stopped crying. She was sitting up straight now, her back against the stone, and she was drawing, a small sketchbook she'd apparently been carrying, her pencil moving quickly across the page. He couldn't see what she was drawing. He didn't need to. He just watched her hands moving, steady again, certain again, doing the thing that made her herself even in the middle of a night like this one. He turned away from the screens. He walked to the back of the security room and sat down in the chair in the corner and stayed there in the dark for a very long time, completely still, the way he got still when something had been decided. Not when a decision was being made, but after, when the calculus was complete and the outcome was already written and all that remained was the execution. The house above him was quiet now. His family was sleeping. His wife was drawing in the garden. And Kang Min-jae, feared by men who were genuinely worth fearing, sat in the dark below his own estate and methodically began dismantling everything he had failed to see. He did not sleep. That was the first thing anyone would have noticed, if anyone had been there to notice. The fact that Kang Min-jae, a man who had trained himself over 2 decades to sleep in 4-hour intervals regardless of circumstance, regardless of what had happened that day or what was coming tomorrow, did not close his eyes once in the security room beneath his estate. He sat in the corner chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely folded, and he watched the clock on the monitor bank move from 11 to midnight to 1 in the morning, and he did not sleep. He thought about the necklace that kept coming back to him. Not the divorce document, not his mother's voice, not even the particular way Hyun-woo had moved his hand with that deliberate, practiced casualness, the kind of casual that takes rehearsal. It was the necklace. The sound it made when it hit the floor, the way Nia had crouched down to pick it up and held it in her palm for just a moment too long before she stood back up. He had watched her do that and understood, with the specific and terrible clarity of a man who had spent his entire adult life reading people in rooms where reading people wrong meant dying, that she had needed that moment, that she was using those 2 or 3 seconds on the floor to find something inside herself, some reserve, some architecture that held her upright before she had to turn around and face them again. 18 months. She had been doing that for 18 months. At 2 in the morning, Park Sung-il knocked twice on the security room door and came in carrying 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who has long ago stopped being surprised by his employer's decisions and has simply committed to being present for them. Sung-il was 53. He had worked for the Kong organization for 21 years. He had a scar across his left jaw from a knife fight in Busan when he was 31, and a daughter in medical school in Seoul, and a way of standing in doorways that suggested he was always ready to either leave or stay, depending entirely on what the room needed. He set one cup on the console and kept the other. "Threat's been assessed," he said. "Credible but not imminent. Likely a probe. Someone testing response protocols before a real move." "Who?" "Still narrowing." The signal came through a proxy chain tied to the Fujimoto network out of Vancouver, but the routing felt borrowed. Could be someone using their infrastructure without their knowledge. Min-jae reached for the coffee. He didn't drink it immediately, just held the cup. "How many people know I'm still in the building?" "You, me, and the 2 guards on the sub-level corridor. I pulled them off the rotation logs." "Keep it that way." Sung-il looked at the monitor bank. The feeds were still running. Most of the house was dark now. The night vision cameras casting everything in that particular gray-green that made familiar rooms look like they belonged to someone else. The winter garden was empty. Nia had gone upstairs sometime around midnight. Her light had gone off at 12:40. "How long have you been watching?" Sung-il asked. Min-jae didn't answer immediately. He drank some of the coffee. It was too hot, but he didn't adjust. "Long enough." Sung-il looked at the feeds for another moment, then looked at his employer, and made the specific calculation that a man makes when he understands that the thing happening in the room is larger than the operational situation he came in to report on. He didn't ask any further questions. He pulled a chair up to the console, sat down, and drank his own coffee. They sat in silence for a while. The monitors cycled. "The dining room footage," Min-jae said finally. "I saw it." "When?" "I pulled the feeds at 10:30 to run the standard overnight review." Sung-il paused. "I was going to brief you in the morning." Min-jae nodded once. That was all. "Hyun-woo," he said. "Just the name, nothing attached to it." "I know," Sung-il said. "Pull everything you have on him. Financials, communications, whatever surveillance we have on the secondary residences." He set the coffee cup down. "I want it on my desk before the house wakes up." Sung-il stood, buttoned his jacket, and moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "The necklace," he said. He wasn't looking back at Min-jae. "I can have someone retrieve it from the corridor floor first thing." The corridor. Min-jae had not checked whether someone had picked it up or whether it was still lying where it had fallen. He pulled up the corridor feed on the right monitor. The hallway was dark, empty, still. Near the base of the wall where the winter garden entrance met the main passage, catching the faint ambient light from the exterior motion sensors, was a small bright point. Still there. No one had picked it up. "I'll get it myself," Min-jae said. Sung-il left without another word. At 2:45 in the morning, Min-jae walked the concealed sub-level corridor to the junction point near the East Utility Passage, came up through the maintenance access behind the laundry anteroom, and moved through his own house in the dark, the way he had moved through dozens of other buildings over the years, silently, with the specific economy of motion that comes not from training alone, but from years of training applied to real situations where the cost of sound is measured in lives. He reached the Winter Garden corridor. The necklace was exactly where the feed had shown it, near the baseboard, the chain folded in on itself where it had fallen, the small oval locket lying open, the tiny photograph inside just barely visible. He crouched down and picked it up with 2 fingers, the same careful way Nia had picked it up hours earlier, and he held it in his palm under the faint ambient light from the garden overhead. The photograph was small, maybe an inch across. A woman in her 40s standing in front of a house, squinting against the sun. Not quite smiling, but almost. There was something around her eyes that he recognized immediately and without analysis. The look of someone who has carried hard things and chosen, despite the weight of them, not to become hard herself. He recognized it because it was the same thing he saw in Nia's face every time she thought no one was watching. He closed the locket carefully. He held it for a moment. Then he put it in the breast pocket of his jacket, against his chest, and walked back to the security room through the dark. The morning came the way November mornings come to Seattle. Gray, reluctant, the light arriving without any real commitment to being light. By 6:15, the kitchen staff was moving. By 7, the household began its standard rhythms. Min-jae watched it all from the monitors while Sung-il's team assembled the file he'd requested. The file was substantial. That was the first thing that told him how long this had been building. Hyun-woo's personal accounts showed 17 transfers over the past 8 months, unremarkable amounts individually, $3,000 to $8,000 each, routed through 2 shell companies in Delaware and 1 in Hong Kong. The kind of routing that was designed to look like operating expenses because someone had studied, at some point, how to make financial crime look like financial management. The total was not enormous. That was the interesting part. The total, across all 17 transfers, was just under $200,000. Not enough to fund a significant operation. Enough to fund a series of smaller ones. Enough to fund, for instance, a sustained process of legal consultations about the dissolution of a marriage. The divorce document Sun Hee had presented the previous evening had not been drafted in the past week. The metadata on the file, pulled by Sung-il's team from the law firm's external server, through methods that the law firm would never be able to legally complain about, showed the first draft had been prepared 4 months ago. 4 months. Nia had been in this house 4 months ago being treated like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, and somewhere below the surface, while Min-jae was in Tokyo closing a deal that added $30 million to the organization's legitimate portfolio, his cousin had been paying a lawyer to draw up the paperwork to remove his wife from his own life. Min-jae sat with that information for a long time. He was still sitting with it at 8:43 when the kitchen monitor showed Nia coming downstairs. She was wearing a charcoal gray cardigan over dark jeans, her hair pulled back, a sketchbook under her arm. She moved through the kitchen with the particular alertness of a person who has learned to read a room before entering it fully. A slight pause at the doorway, a quick scan, shoulders dropping a fraction when she confirmed she was alone, except for the 2 kitchen staff who had long ago established themselves as neutral parties in whatever was happening in this house. One of them, a young woman named Hyejin, who had started 6 months ago, set a cup of coffee on the counter near the window where Nia always sat without being asked. Nia looked at it, then at Hyejin, and said something Min-jae couldn't hear from the monitor. Hyejin smiled. Small things. The small things that build over time into the only map you have of a place. His mother came on at 9:15. The kitchen changed the moment she entered it. Hyejin straightened. The older staff member near the stove became very focused on whatever was on the stove, and Nia, without appearing to move at all, became slightly more contained, the way a person gets when they are deciding in real time how much of themselves to show. Sun Hee looked at the coffee cup in front of Nia. She looked at Hyejin, and she said something that made Hyejin's expression go carefully blank, in the way that people's expressions go blank when they are receiving an instruction they are not certain they are allowed to refuse. Min-jae leaned forward. He couldn't hear it. He pulled up the kitchen audio. There was a 40-second delay on the audio feeds due to the encryption routing, and waited. When it came through, his mother's voice was perfectly pleasant. That was the thing about Sun Hee that he had understood intellectually for years but had never fully reckoned with. She was pleasant when she was being the most deliberate. Warmth was her operational mode. The warmth was the weapon. Hyejin, she was saying, from now on, morning preparation in the kitchen follows the household priority order. Coffee service is prepared for family members first. If there are additional staff resources, they may be allocated to other residents at the discretion of the head of household. Other residents. Not the mistress of the house, not Min-jae's wife. Other residents. Hyejin said, yes, ma'am, because she was 24 years old and needed this job and had no framework yet for the specific courage required to say anything else. Nia had heard all of it. She was looking out the window. She had not touched the coffee since his mother came into the room. Good morning, Sun Hee said to Nia, pleasantly, as though the previous 60 seconds hadn't happened. Good morning, Nia said. That was all. 2 sentences. The entire architecture of the exchange contained in the gap between them. Hyun-woo appeared at 9:47 with the energy of someone who had slept well and was looking forward to the day. He was wearing a dark blue sweater and carrying his phone and moving through the house with the specific ease of a man who believes, incorrectly, that the outcome of yesterday is settled and confirmed. He poured himself coffee, his own coffee, from his own cup, from the pot that had been waiting on the warmer, and he leaned against the kitchen island and said to the room in general, "Anyone know if the roads are clear? I have a lunch in Bellevue." Nobody answered him immediately. Then Nia said, without looking up from her sketchbook, "There's construction on 520 through mid-December. You'd be better going south through Renton." Hyunwoo looked at her. There was a specific quality to the look, something that had recalibrated slightly from last night, something that was working out whether to be dismissive or cautious. He chose dismissive because caution would have required acknowledging that she had just given him useful information, which would have required treating her like a person worth listening to. "I know the roads," he said. "Okay," she said, and went back to sketching. He left the kitchen at 9:52. At 10:15, the house manager, a man named Mr. Baek, who had been with the Kong family for 14 years and wore that tenure like a credential, held a brief meeting with the 3 remaining household staff in the service corridor off the main laundry. Min-jae watched it on the corridor feed. He could not hear it from this angle, no audio pickup in the service passage, but he could read the body language without difficulty. Baek stood with his hands behind his back and spoke for approximately 90 seconds. The 3 staff members nodded in the particular way that people nod when they are being told something that makes them uncomfortable, and they have decided to absorb the discomfort rather than resist the instruction. Sungil had placed a secondary audio unit in the service corridor 3 months ago during a routine security upgrade. The delay was longer from that unit, nearly 2 minutes, but it was there. When it came through, Min-jae listened to Mr. Baek explain to 3 people who had worked in his house that while the primary household authority, that was the phrase he used, primary household authority, was traveling on business, all operational requests from non-family residents should be logged, but not actioned without approval from Mrs. Kong Sr. or a designated family representative. Non-family residents, his wife, his house, 14 years. Min-jae pressed his fingertips against the edge of the console and breathed out slowly through his nose and made himself stay in the chair, because the alternative, the thing his body wanted to do at this particular moment, was not useful. Not yet. He needed to see how far it went. The answer arrived at 11:20, when Nia went to the estate's private garage to retrieve a set of design samples she had stored in the storage unit, adjacent to the vehicle bay, an arrangement she'd set up herself 4 months ago because her studio upstairs didn't have sufficient flat storage for large format materials. The storage unit was locked. It had not been locked before. She had a key for it. She'd had a key for it for 4 months. But when she tried the key, it did not work, which meant the lock had been changed, which meant someone had changed it between last night and this morning, which was a very specific kind of message. She stood in front of the locked storage unit for a long moment with her key in her hand. Then she went back into the main house and found Baek in the east corridor near the formal sitting room. Min-jae pulled up the east corridor feed and turned the audio all the way up. "Mr. Baek," Nia said. Her voice was level. "The storage unit in the garage has a new lock. I wasn't notified of any change to the access system. I need my design materials." Baek clasped his hands in front of him. "Mrs. Kang, there was a general security review of all storage areas on the estate this morning. Access permissions are being reconfigured. When will I have access to my materials?" "That's a question for the family's security team. I'm asking you." Baek met her eyes. He was not unkind about it. That was almost the worst part of it, the way it was delivered without hostility, the way the cruelty was entirely procedural. "I'm not in a position to restore access without authorization from the household authority." "I am the household authority." Baek said nothing. Nia looked at him for a moment. She said, "Those materials are mine. They belong to my work. They have nothing to do with the estate." "Mrs. Kong, my clients are expecting deliverables this week. My professional work is in that unit." "Mrs. Kong." A pause. A breath. "I'm very sorry." He was. The sorrow was real. Min-jae could see it in the way the man's shoulders dropped slightly, the genuine discomfort of a person executing an instruction he would have preferred not to receive. But sorry without action was just a sound. It was just air. Nia looked at him for another moment. Then she turned and walked back upstairs. Min-jae stood up from the console chair. He had not stood up in several hours. His back registered the time he'd spent sitting with a dull ache across his shoulders, that he ignored the way. He ignored most things his body reported when there was something else that mattered more. He stood in the blue-gray light of the security room and looked at the monitor showing the east corridor, Baek still standing there, alone now, with his hands clasped and his eyes on the floor. And he made several decisions in quick succession, the way he always made decisions when the information was complete and the only remaining variable was sequence. He picked up his phone. He called Sung-il. "I need access to the legal team, not the family's legal team, my personal attorney. Kim Dong-hyun." "Now?" "Now." "He's in the middle of a—" "Now, Sung-il." Pause. "Give me 8 minutes." Min-jae set the phone down and went back to the monitors. He pulled up the upstairs corridor feed, Nia's studio. The light was on under the door. She was inside. He couldn't see her, but he knew what she was doing. She was sitting at her drafting table in the one room in this house that was entirely hers, working on designs for a community center in Rainier Valley where children would one day play, and she was doing it with whatever materials she had upstairs, because the ones she really needed were locked away from her in her own home. The phone buzzed. Sung-il had Kim Dong-hyun on hold. Min-jae picked up. "Dong-hyun," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer." "Always." The attorney's voice was slightly careful. The careful of a man who knows that when his client calls at 11 in the morning asking for straight answers, the next 30 minutes are going to require his full attention. If someone presents a spouse with a dissolution agreement without the other spouse's knowledge or involvement, what does that expose them to legally? A very brief silence. Depends on the jurisdiction and the specifics of the agreement. In Washington state, both parties must have independent legal representation for a marital settlement to be enforceable. A document prepared by one party's legal team and presented without the other party's counsel present is almost certainly voidable. At minimum, potentially grounds for bad faith claims in the broader divorce proceeding if one were ever filed. Who presented the agreement? That's not the question right now. Another silence. Min-jae, is Nia all right? He looked at the monitor showing the strip of light under her studio door. "She will be," he said. He ended the call. At 12:30, Hyun-woo returned from his lunch in Bellevue. Min-jae tracked him from the gate camera through the vehicle bay entrance to the main corridor, watched him move through the house with the same ease he'd had that morning, the ease of a man who believed he had already won something. Hyun-woo stopped in the main corridor near the bottom of the staircase, pulled out his phone, and made a call that lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Sung-il had the call pulled within 6 minutes of its conclusion. The number was registered to a communications relay service, the kind that routes calls through third-party infrastructure to obscure origin points. Consumer grade, not professional. Which told Min-jae that whoever was on the other end of that call was not someone Hyun-woo had hired through the organization's professional channels, which meant he was operating outside any structure that Min-jae could have seen through official reporting, which meant he had been hiding it. The content of the call was not recoverable at the relay level, encryption protocols that were just sophisticated enough to block a standard intercept. But Sung-il's team had secondary coverage through the cell tower triangulation, and the target phone's location at the time of the call had been logged. The target phone had been in a parking structure in Sodo. That alone meant nothing, but a phone registered to the same relay service had pinged the same parking structure on 2 previous occasions in the past 6 weeks, and on both of those occasions, one of the estate's perimeter cameras had logged an unregistered vehicle, different plates each time, but the same make, model, and color, a gray Jeep Grand Cherokee, parked on the access road outside the estate's east fence line for periods ranging from 40 minutes to 2 hours. Someone had been watching the house. Min-jae looked at the parking structure location on the digital map Sung-il had pulled up. He looked at the dates of the previous pings. He looked at the timestamp on the first draft of the divorce document, 4 months ago. He drew the line between those 3 points and understood what the line meant. This had not begun as humiliation. The humiliation, the dinners, the necklace, the locked storage, the paperwork, was the surface. Something else had been building underneath it, and whatever it was, it had been building long enough to establish patterns that showed up in cell tower logs and parking structure timestamps, and 17 wire transfers totaling just under $200,000. He closed the map. He looked at the clock on the monitor bank. It was 1:44 in the afternoon. The house had been going about its day as though everything was ordinary. His mother was in the formal sitting room. Ju-young was somewhere in the west wing. Hyun-woo had gone up to his rooms after the call. Baek was managing the afternoon kitchen preparation. And Nia was still in her studio, the light still on under the door, working with whatever she had. Min Jae picked up his phone one more time. He did not call Sung Il. He did not call the attorney. He scrolled to a contact he rarely called directly, a man named Choi Byung-soo, who ran the organization's internal audit function and who had, over 12 years, developed the specific skill of reconstructing financial histories from fragments in a way that was both thorough and untraceable. Byung-soo, he said when the call connected, I need a full audit on Park Hyun-woo's authorized access to organizational accounts going back 18 months. The silence on the other end was the silence of a man doing rapid math. That's a significant scope. Yes. It'll take some time to, you have until tomorrow morning. A longer silence. Understood. Min Jae ended the call and stood very still in the security room. Outside, in the house above him, his family moved through their afternoon. His mother rang for tea. His cousin turned on a television somewhere in the upper corridor. Somewhere in the estate's kitchen, someone was beginning the preparation for dinner. Another dinner, another evening, another careful performance around a table that had been turned into a staging ground. What they did not know, what none of them knew, was that the man they believed was somewhere over the Pacific Ocean had spent the last 18 hours below their feet, watching, listening, pulling threads, and following each one to where it ended. And every thread ended in the same place. Every thread ended with his wife, alone, protecting people who were trying to erase her. At 2:15, Hyun-woo came back downstairs. He went to the kitchen. He spoke briefly with Baek. Min Jae watched the exchange but couldn't pull audio fast enough to catch it. And then he saw Baek nod and turn and walk toward the east corridor. And something shifted in the way the afternoon was moving, something that felt like acceleration. He pulled up every ground floor feed simultaneously. Beck was moving toward the staff communication board near the service entrance, an old-fashioned system, a physical board with magnetic markers that the household used for shift assignments and delivery tracking and internal notes. Min Jae watched him reach up and move two markers, reassigning their positions, and then write something on the board in the quick, careful print of a man who was transcribing an instruction rather than composing one. He couldn't read the writing from the camera angle. He switched to the maintenance unit embedded in the ventilation access above the board, a camera so small it was essentially invisible, placed there 18 months ago when Min Jae had first moved Nia into the estate and had understood, in a way he had not fully examined until now, that he had known even then that something in this house would need watching. The writing resolved on the monitor. 6 words. Mrs. Brooks has no authority here. Mrs. Brooks. Not Mrs. Kang, not the mistress of the house. Mrs. Brooks, her maiden name, used deliberately, a small erasure disguised as a clarification, placed on a board where every staff member who passed through the service entrance would see it. Min Jae looked at those 6 words for a very long time. Then he walked to the corner of the security room, to the small cabinet mounted above the secondary console, and he opened it and removed the master security recording drive, the unit that compiled all feeds simultaneously into a single time-stamped archive, and he connected it to the primary output and began transferring everything from the previous 22 hours onto a secure server that existed outside the estate's network and outside the organization's standard infrastructure and was accessible only to him and to Kim Dong-hyun, his personal attorney. He transferred the dining room footage, the corridor footage, the Winter Garden audio, the kitchen exchanges, Baek's service corridor meeting, Hyun-woo's phone call timing and location data, the staff communication board, all of it. He labeled the file with the date and a single notation, evidence. He locked it. He looked at the clock. 2:41 in the afternoon. The family dinner was scheduled for 7. He had 4 hours and 19 minutes. He sat back down in the corner chair, folded his hands, and began to think through the morning that was going to come. Not tonight, not the dinner, but the morning after, when the bronze doors of the grand dining hall would open and the man they believed was over the Pacific would be standing in the room and the recordings would be playing on every screen, and his mother would understand for the first time what it meant to underestimate the surveillance capacity of the man she had raised, and his cousin would look across a table and see his own voice coming back at him from speakers embedded in walls he had always believed were merely walls, and Nia would be standing beside him. Not behind him, beside him. He had not worked out how to tell her what he knew. That was the part he kept coming back to. Not the logistics of the morning, he had the logistics. He had been building logistics his entire career. The part he kept returning to was simpler and harder than logistics. He kept coming back to the moment in the winter garden when she had whispered that she was protecting him, and the fact that she had done it in the one corner of the garden where she believed no camera could see her because she wasn't performing it. She wasn't saying it for anyone. She was just saying it. To herself. Or to the woman in the photograph. Or to no one. Just saying the true thing in the dark, because sometimes that's all you can do with the true thing. He reached into his breast pocket. He took out the necklace, held it in his palm, turned the small locket over once. He would have it repaired in the morning. He knew a jeweler on First Avenue who had worked on estate pieces before, who could reattach the chain and check the clasp and make it right again. He would have it ready before the day was done. Before she needed to know any of the rest of it, she would have this back. Whole. It wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. But it was where he was going to start. Above him, the house moved toward evening. The kitchen staff began the dinner preparations. The smell of something braised and complex filtered down even through the sublevel ventilation, and Min-jae sat in the security room with a broken necklace in his hand and 4 hours until the last ordinary dinner this household would ever have. And he felt, underneath everything, underneath the cold calculation and the building anger and the methodical construction of what was coming, something else. Something that was not rage and not strategy, and not the specific satisfaction of a man who has identified his enemies and confirmed his approach. Something that felt, if he was being completely honest with himself in the way that very dark and very quiet rooms sometimes require you to be, like the specific and overdue grief of a man who has spent his whole life building walls to protect things he valued and has just understood, too late and too clearly, that he built every wall facing outward and left the inside completely unprotected. He closed his hand around the necklace. Outside, the Seattle night began to settle over the estate. Early, the way it did in November, the dark arriving before you were ready for it. And somewhere above him, in a studio with the lights still on, his wife was drawing buildings that hadn't been built yet. And the house was as quiet as it always was when the wrong people believed they had already won. The dinner that night was quiet in the wrong way. Not the quiet of a house at rest, the quiet of a house that had already decided something and was waiting for the deciding to catch up with the people inside it. The kitchen staff moved with the particular efficiency of people who were working harder than usual, because working harder than usual was the only thing they could control. The table had been set with the formal service, the white and gold porcelain that only came out when Sun Hee wanted to mark an occasion, and nobody had explained to anyone what the occasion was. Nia came downstairs at 6:58. She had changed into a dark burgundy dress, her hair down, the kind of quiet effort that spoke not of performance but of dignity, of a woman who had decided that the way she showed up to a room said something about her that she was not willing to let circumstances dictate. She had the sketchbook under her arm the way she always did, a habit so ingrained it had become essentially physical, like an extension of her hand. She did not have the necklace on. She had nothing around her throat at all, and the absence of it was its own statement, though she was the only one at the table who understood what the statement was. Sun Hee was already seated, Ju Young beside her. Hyunwoo at the side position he had claimed by default over the months, the position that faced the room's entrance so that he could watch who came in, a small territorial habit that Nia had noticed and filed away a long time ago. The three distant relatives occupied the far end. Beck stood near the service door in his standard evening posture, hands behind his back, eyes forward. Nia sat down. She placed the sketchbook on the empty chair beside her. Min-jae's chair, the one at the head of the table that sat empty and somehow still exerted gravity over the room, and she reached for her water glass and drank from it and set it down and looked at no one in particular. "You look tired," Hyunwoo said. "I'm fine," she said. "Long day, staying in the house." He cut into the meat on his plate with the practiced ease of a man performing normalcy. "You should get out more. Fresh air." Nia said nothing. Sun Hee was watching her from the end of the table with an expression that Nia had stopped trying to decode months ago. It was too layered, too many things moving behind it simultaneously, and trying to read it always felt like trying to read a document written in a language that used the same letters she knew, but in combinations that didn't resolve into meaning. "I want to speak to you after dinner," Sun Hee said. To Nia, directly. "All right," Nia said. "In the study." "All right." Ju Young looked briefly at her soup. One of the distant relatives at the far end made a small, contained sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a cough. Something in between that required no acknowledgement. Nia registered it and let it pass through her without snagging. The dinner took 45 minutes. It felt longer. The food was good. It was always good. The kitchen staff did their job regardless of whatever theater was happening in the rooms above them. And Nia ate most of what was in front of her because she had learned that eating was practical and skipping meals in this house only made the evening harder. And the evenings were always harder. At 7:47, she followed Sun-hee to the study. The study was Min-jae's room in the truest sense. It smelled like him, like the cedar and black tea combination that had embedded itself in the shelves and the upholstery over years of his presence in the space. Nia always felt the weight of his absence most acutely in this room. Tonight that weight was different. Tonight it felt almost like company. Sun-hee did not sit. She stood near the desk with her hands clasped in front of her, and she looked at Nia with an expression that had resolved, finally, into something Nia recognized clearly: certainty. The expression of a person who believes the outcome of a situation is no longer in question. "I'm going to be direct with you," Sun-hee said. "Please," Nia said. "The agreement I presented to you last night, I'd like you to reconsider." "I haven't considered it at all. I said no." "You said no impulsively. In a corridor without counsel, without—" "I said no because it is no." Nia kept her voice at the same temperature it had been all day. Not warm, not cold, just steady. The steadiness of a woman who has been making structural decisions for years and knows the difference between a wall that will hold and one that's already compromised. "My marriage is not a business arrangement that your family's legal team can modify in my husband's absence." Sun-hee tilted her head slightly. The certainty in her expression didn't shift. If anything, it settled deeper, like something finding its foundation. "You believe Min-jae will come home and everything will remain as it is. I believe Min-jae and I are married, and that's a fact that doesn't require his physical presence to remain true." "You believe," Sun-hee said slowly, "that you understand my son." "I know my husband." Sun-hee smiled. It was not a cruel smile. That was the disorienting thing. It was something almost like sadness, or the face that sadness makes when it has lived long enough to calcify into something harder. "You know the man he becomes when he is looking at you. That is not the same thing." Nia felt something move through her. Not quite fear, not quite certainty, but the specific sensation of a floor that has just shifted fractionally underfoot. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means," Sun-hee said, "that there are things about Min-jae's arrangements, his plans, his obligations to this family, that predate you by 20 years. Things that have never been discussed in your presence because they were never yours to discuss." She paused. "He is my son. I know what he has agreed to. I know what his position requires. And I know that what he requires is not something you are equipped to provide." Nia looked at her for a long moment. "Then tell me," Nia said quietly. "What has he agreed to?" Sun-hee studied her. The study was quiet. The house was settling into its post-dinner calm, and the sound from elsewhere in the building was muffled by the solid walls and heavy door. "There is a family in Seoul, the Park family. Not Hyun-woo's branch, the senior line. Arrangements were made when Min-jae was 31. They were suspended when he chose to pursue other interests, but they were never formally dissolved." She let that sit in the air for a moment. They were never formally dissolved because Min-jae understood that one day the organization would require a consolidation that only that alliance could achieve. The floor shifted again. Nia did not look away from Sun-hee's face. She was working very hard not to look away because she understood that the moment she looked away, she would give this woman something she would never give back. "You're telling me," Nia said, "that my husband has a prior arrangement." "A prior obligation," Sun-hee said gently. "One that he has perhaps delayed longer than he should have. One that the current circumstances in our Singapore operations have made newly urgent." She opened a drawer in the desk, Min-jae's desk, and removed a single-page document. Not the multi-page agreement from last night, one page. She placed it on the desk and turned it so it faced Nia. "This is not a dissolution agreement. This is simply an acknowledgement, a private document, witnessed only within the family, that your marriage was entered into under circumstances that both parties understood to be conditional." Nia looked at the document without touching it. "Conditional on what?" she said. "On its continued service to the family's needs." The silence that followed was the longest silence of the evening. Nia looked at the paper. She looked at Min Jae's desk, the pen holder she had given him on his birthday 8 months ago, a brushed steel design with his initials that he kept directly in front of him when he worked. She looked at the books on the shelves, the ones he'd actually read, and the ones that were there because they had always been there, the ones she knew apart by the wear on their spines. She looked at all of it, and she made herself breathe. "I'm not going to sign that," she said. "Nia, don't." The word came out with more force than she intended, not loud but sharp, with an edge she'd been keeping filed down all day and which had just for one syllable slipped free. She pulled it back immediately, breathed, began again, quieter. "Don't use my name like you're trying to comfort me. You're not trying to comfort me." She straightened. "I'm going to go upstairs. If there is something Min Jae needs to discuss with me when he returns, he can discuss it with me. Not you. Not through a document prepared by your lawyers." She moved to the door. "Good night, Mrs. Kong." She left the study and walked upstairs and closed her bedroom door behind her and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a very long time. She did not cry. She had cried last night. Tonight she felt something different, drier, more contained, like a room that has been stripped of everything that wasn't essential and is just down to walls and floor. She sat with the things Sun Hee had said and held it up to the light of everything she knew about Min Jae and looked at the places where it fit and the places where it didn't and tried to be honest with herself about which was which. Prior obligation, conditional marriage, the Park family and soul. She did not know. That was the honest answer. She did not know if it was true because she did not know everything that had existed in Min Jae's life before her. She knew the man he was when he was with her. Sun Hee was right about that much. She knew that man well. But she did not know everything that man carried. And not knowing tonight felt like standing on a surface she could not fully see. In the security room below, Min Jae had watched the study scene through the desk camera, a unit he'd installed in the spine of the third book from the left on the middle shelf, a copy of The Art of War that no one ever touched 3 years ago. He had heard every word. He had watched Nia's face through the whole of it, watched the specific discipline it required to hold herself together through something that specific, that targeted, that designed to find the crack in the foundation. He had also heard what Sun Hee said about soul, and that was the thing that brought him upright from the console chair with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, because it was not entirely false. That was the part that was going to be hardest to explain. There had been an arrangement, 31 years old, 18 months before he met Nia, a conversation between families that had been positioned to him as strategic rather than personal. The Park family's eldest daughter, a business alliance framed as a marriage, a consolidation of two networks that would have represented a significant expansion of the organization's regional reach. He had not agreed to it formally. He had not signed anything, but he had not refused it either. He had said he needed time, which in the language of those conversations was not a no, it was a postponement, and postponements in that world had a way of accumulating interest. He had met Nia 4 months later. He had not gone back to the conversation. He had not, in the time between then and now, formally or informally dissolved the arrangement, because dissolving it would have required acknowledging that it existed in a form that could be dissolved, which would have required a conversation with his mother that he had been, in a way he was only now fully willing to examine, avoiding. He had told himself it was irrelevant. He had told himself that a conversation without signatures was not a binding obligation. He had told himself that the life he was building with Nia superseded everything that had come before it. He had not told Nia. He sat with that for a long moment, the specific gravity of it, the way it recontextualized certain things. Not everything, not most things, but certain things. The reason his mother had never fully accepted Nia, the reason Hyun-woo had always carried that particular quality of contempt, not just prejudice, though that was there too, but something else underneath it, something that felt more like impatience, as though he were waiting for a conclusion that should have already been reached. The reason the divorce document had been 4 months in preparation. They believed they were cleaning up an arrangement that had merely been delayed. They believed Min Jae had simply gotten distracted, that Nia was an interlude, a complication, something that would resolve itself once the original plan reasserted its logic. They believed that because he had never told them otherwise. Not directly, not in terms that closed the door. He pressed both hands flat on the console surface and stared at the dark monitor showing his wife's bedroom, no camera in the room itself, Just the corridor outside, the strip of light under the door. And he understood that the thing he had to do in the morning was not only about his mother and Hyunwoo and the recordings and the financial audit. The thing he had to do in the morning was also about telling the truth to the person who deserved it most. At 11:15, Sung-il knocked and entered with a tablet in his hand and an expression that had moved past careful into something more urgent. "Byung-soo flagged something," he said, "in the financial review." "What?" Sung-il handed him the tablet. Hyun-woo's authorized access to the organizational accounts goes back further than 18 months. He's been drawing from the development fund, the Singapore allocation, for just over 2 years. "How much?" "Total? Just under $3 million. The number landed in the room without drama. $3 million over 2 years from an account that funded infrastructure development in the organization's Southeast Asian operations, redirected through channels that had been painstakingly obscured but not painstakingly enough. Not once someone with Byung-soo's specific skill set started pulling the thread with the right authorization. "What was it used for?" Min-jae asked. "We're still mapping the full picture, but the last 3 months of outflows point toward a private security contractor, a firm based in Vancouver with no public-facing business profile. Byung-soo found a paper connection between that firm and 2 names we've flagged before from the Fujimoto network." Min-jae looked up from the tablet. "The same network the tarmac threat came through," he said. Sung-il met his eyes. "Yes." The room was very quiet. Min-jae set the tablet down on the console and stood absolutely still for approximately 4 seconds. The specific stillness of a man processing information that has just rearranged the structure of everything he thought he was dealing with. Because this was no longer a family dispute about inheritance and bloodlines and a marriage that the wrong people wanted dissolved. This was not Sun-hee and Hyun-woo overstepping in the way that families sometimes overstep when a patriarch's attention is elsewhere. This was something else. "He hired the threat," Min-jae said. "Not a question. We can't confirm it yet with Sung-il." A pause. "The financial connection is there. The contractor, the network, the timing. The threat came through 8 hours before your scheduled departure. If someone wanted to ground you and force you into a security protocol that removed you from visibility, they'd have me locked in the estate for the duration." Min-jae finished the sentence himself, while the family executed the next phase. "Which would be?" Min-jae looked at the study monitor. Dark now. Sun-hee had retired. He looked at the corridor outside Nia's room, light still on under the door. "The divorce document was phase 1, he said slowly, working it through in real time. "Presented while I'm supposedly in Singapore, build a record of her refusing, establish grounds for a contested proceeding. Phase 2 is the financial separation. Access to her materials locked, household authority stripped, staff realigned. Make her practically invisible in her own home." He paused. "What's phase 3? Sung-il didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "What did Byung-soo find?" Min-jae said. "One of the outflows from last month," Sung-il said carefully. "Went to a holding company we've traced to an event management firm. They have a contract for the annual foundation gala." The gala. The Kong Foundation's annual charity event, scheduled for 3 weeks from now, held in the estate's main ballroom, 400 guests, an evening that the organization's legitimate philanthropic face presented to the Seattle social world every November. An event that Nia, as the wife of the organization's head, was prominently featured in. An event where she would be visible, in public, in a room full of people. A room that a private security contractor with Fujimoto network connections had apparently paid to access. The cold that moved through Min-jae then was not the cold of anger or even fear. It was the cold of absolute clarity, the specific temperature of a situation that has revealed its full shape and whose full shape is considerably worse than the partial shape you thought you were working with. "Pull the gala contract," he said. "Every vendor, every name on the access list, every security subcontractor the firm hired. Already started. And I want the gray Jeep found, the one from the perimeter logs, tonight. I have 2 teams on it." Min-jae picked up the tablet again and looked at the financial map Byung-soo's team had built, the web of transfers, the shell companies, the contractor connection, and he understood that what he had been watching from the security room for the past 24 hours was not the ugly interior of a family power struggle. It was the visible surface of something that had roots deep enough to have been growing for 2 years, right below him, funded with money he had earned, executed by a person who sat at his table and ate his food and called him cousin. Hyun-woo had not just been trying to remove Naya, he had been trying to remove Min-jae. Not physically, or perhaps eventually physically, but not yet. The immediate architecture of it was financial and structural: strip Min-jae's marriage, destabilize his domestic authority, fracture his personal relationships, create the conditions under which the organization's captains would begin to question whether the man at the top had the household under control. Because in this world, the private and the professional were not separate. A man who could not manage his own family was a man whose judgment came into question. A man whose judgment came into question was a man whose position became eligible for challenge. Hyun-woo had been building a case for succession, using Min-jae's absence, using his mother's genuine, if brutal, biases, using a necklace and a locked storage unit and a staff communication board with 6 words on it, small instruments, carefully placed, the kind that worked precisely because they were small enough to be dismissed individually while accumulating into something structural. And Nia had been the lever. Not because Hyun-woo hated her specifically, because she was the most effective point of pressure, the newest element in Min-jae's life, the one with the least institutional protection, the one who could be isolated and discredited and eventually removed in a way that would create maximum disruption at minimum visible cost. She had been targeted not out of prejudice alone, though the prejudice was real and it had made the targeting easier, but because she was the thing Min-jae had chosen that Hyun-woo had not been able to control or predict or incorporate into his calculation. And she had survived it by not fighting, which was something Hyun-woo had not accounted for either. Min-jae set the tablet down and looked at the time. 12:41 in the morning. The morning was 6 hours away. He picked up his phone and he made 3 calls in quick to Kim Dong-hyun, to the organization's senior captain in Seattle, to the head of the legitimate business division who would need to be briefed before any public actions were taken. He kept each call under 5 minutes. He did not explain more than was necessary. He told each person what he needed from them by 8 in the morning, and he told them the consequences of it not being ready. Then he made a 4th call. This one he held the phone for a long time before he dialed. The line rang twice. Yeah. The voice was Byung-soo, surprised. The senior financial auditor was used to communicating through Sung-il's channel, not through a direct call at 12:45 in the morning. The Singapore allocation, Min-jae said. The 3 million. I need to know if any of that money moved in a direction that affected the gala's security planning. A pause. The sound of a keyboard. I'm still mapping the contractor connection. What I have right now is the payment to the holding company. I can't confirm yet what services were contracted. How long to confirm? If I pull my whole team in tonight, 4 hours, maybe 5. Pull your whole team in. Understood. Byung-soo. He stopped. Adjusted. No one outside your team knows about this audit yet. Keep it that way until I tell you otherwise. Yes, sir. He ended the call. He sat in the corner chair and closed his eyes for the first time in nearly 20 hours and let himself exist for 30 seconds in a space without monitors or audio feeds or documents or the specific terrible knowledge of what people are capable of when they believe they are unobserved. 30 seconds. Then he opened his eyes. At 6:15 the following morning, before the kitchen staff arrived, before the household stirred, before the night rotation handed off to the day guards, Min-jae came up from the sub-level corridor into the laundry anteroom and walked through his own house in the early gray light. He moved through the kitchen, past the service corridor with its communication board, into the east hallway, and up the stairs to the 2nd floor. He stopped outside Nia's bedroom. He looked at the door for a moment. He knocked. Quietly. A pause. Movement behind the door. Then her voice, alert, not sleepy, the voice of a person who had been awake. Yes? It's me, he said. The silence that came after that was one he could not read from the other side of a door. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds, 4 seconds in which he stood in the early morning quiet of the 2nd floor hallway of his own house and waited for his wife to decide whether to open the door. She opened it. She was dressed, the same dark jeans from yesterday, a different sweater, her hair down. Her eyes moved over him with the rapid assessment of a person trying to process something that doesn't fit the expected shape of the world. And then they found the specific thing she'd been processing and resolved it. He was real. He was here. He was standing in the hallway when he was supposed to be somewhere over the Pacific. "When did you—" she started. "Yesterday morning," he said. "I never left." She looked at him. He reached into his breast pocket and took out the necklace. The chain had been repaired. He'd called the First Avenue jeweler at 6 that morning, a man who understood that unusual requests at unusual hours from this particular client were to be addressed without curiosity, and who had met Sung-il at a side entrance at 6:45 and returned the necklace with the chain resoldered and the clasp replaced within the hour. Minji held it out to her, the locket in his palm, the chain hanging from his fingers. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked at him. "How much did you hear?" she said. "Everything," he said. The word landed between them with a weight that had nothing to do with volume. He watched her face move through several things in quick succession. Something that might have been relief, something that might have been mortification, something that resolved finally into a composure that he recognized as hard-won, because he had been watching her win it for 24 hours against people who were trying specifically to take it from her. "Min-jae," she said. Her voice was careful. "There are things I need to ask you." "I know," he said. "There are things I need to tell you." He kept his hand extended with the necklace. "Can I come in?" She stepped back. He came inside and she closed the door behind them, and the morning was gray and early outside the bedroom windows, and the house below them was still quiet with the specific quiet of the last minutes before a household wakes and resumes its ordinary motion. But ordinary was already over. It had been over since the necklace hit the floor, and what was coming next? In the grand dining hall, in front of every screen, in front of every person who had participated in the 24 hours he had spent below his own floors listening to the architecture of his family's betrayal, was not going to resemble anything ordinary. He sat down in the chair near the window. She sat on the edge of the bed, and they looked at each other in the gray morning light, and he began, for the first time in their 18 months of marriage, to tell her everything without leaving anything out, including the parts that reflected badly on him, including Seoul, including the arrangement that he had never formally ended and which his silence about had given his mother enough rope to build a case for, including the full shape of what Hyun-woo had been constructing in the months beneath both their feet. He told her all of it. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, the room was completely quiet. Outside the windows, the Seattle morning was beginning to define itself. The gray lightning, the first sounds of traffic on the distant road. Nia was looking at her hands. The necklace was around her throat now. She had put it on while he was talking, not ceremonially, just the way you put on something that belongs there, a habit re-established. She raised her eyes. "The gala," she said. "You think the contractor has access to the gala. I think someone paid to have access to a room where you'll be in public." She was quiet for a moment. He watched her process it. Not the fear first, but the structure of it, the way an architect processes a problem, looking for the load-bearing points, identifying where the stress was concentrated. "So the morning," she said, "the dining room, the screens, that's happening today." "Yes." She looked at him. "And you need me there." "I need you to decide if you want to be." Something moved across her face, complicated, layered, the specific expression of a person who has been offered a choice that feels both exactly right and completely unexpected. She had spent 18 months finding ways to not be in rooms where things were being decided about her. He was asking her to be in the room, to be in it intentionally, fully, in front of all of them. She looked at the window for a long moment. "What time?" she said. 8, he said. "Before the staff rotation. Before anyone has their footing for the day." She nodded once. Then she stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the gray Seattle morning, and she stood there for a moment with her hands at her sides and the necklace at her throat, and the bearing of a woman who has already survived the hardest night and is now simply deciding how to walk through the door that comes after it. "I have one condition," she said, without turning around. "Tell me. Whatever happens in that room, I speak for myself. You don't speak for me. You don't explain me or defend me or position me." She turned then, and she looked at him directly. "I am not something that needs to be explained." Min-jae looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "You're not." She held his gaze for another beat, and then something in her face settled. Not softened, settled, the way a structure settles when the load is finally correctly distributed and the whole thing can do what it was designed to do. Then let's go, she said. And the morning that was about to change everything in that house had just found the last piece it needed. Part 4 của kịch bản điện ảnh này được triển khai với dung lượng viết đủ 41% vào 5.000 từ. Bắt đầu trực tiếp từ điểm kết thúc của Part 3. Trọng tâm tuyệt đối là cao trào bùng nổ, the peak of action and stakes. Mọi mâu thuẫn từ các phần trước giờ đây hội tụ thành một cuộc đối đầu trực diện, không khoan nhượng. Nhịp điệu kịch bản phải cực kỳ dồn dập, căng thẳng đến mức nghẹt thở. Duy trì giọng văn mỹ thô ráp, tập trung vào những chi tiết bản năng, tiếng tim đập, sự đau đớn thể xác, mồ hôi hòa lẫn máu và sự quyết liệt trong ánh mắt. Nhân vật phải thực hiện những lựa chọn liều lĩnh nhất, chấp nhận đánh đổi mọi thứ để đạt được mục tiêu. Hội thoại trong phần này cần gãy gọn, sắc bén, đôi khi là những tiếng hét hoặc những lời nói đứt quãng vì kiệt sức. Triển khai chi tiết từng phân cảnh hành động hoặc đối đầu tâm lý, scene by scene. Tuyệt đối không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng, tiêu đề phụ hay nhắc đến thực thể tôn giáo. Kết thúc Part 4 ở đỉnh điểm kịch tính, ngay trước khi trận chiến cuối cùng ngã ngũ. Hãy trình bày trực tiếp trong tin nhắn, viết cực kỳ chi tiết. Nếu đặt giới hạn phản hồi, hãy dừng lại ở một câu dang dở để tôi ra lệnh viết tiếp. Chỉ đần bắt buộc. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu nhằm mục đích giải trí, không dựa trên bất kỳ sự kiện hay nhân vật có thật nào. Lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng, nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dừng giữa câu, hãy viết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh, không mở rộng nội dung. The bronze doors opened at 8:04 in the morning. Not dramatically, that was the thing nobody in the dining hall would remember correctly afterward, because memory has a way of adding drama to moments that didn't need it. The doors simply opened. The mechanism was smooth, well-maintained, the way everything in the Kong estate was well-maintained, and the sound they made was not a crash or a bang, but the low, certain sound of heavy things moving on precise hinges. A sound that belonged to a room of this size, and simply, on this particular morning, carried more weight than it ever had before. Min-jae walked in wearing the same charcoal travel suit he'd had on when his family watched him leave for the airport 31 hours ago. Nobody spoke. The breakfast table had 7 people at it. Sun-hee with her morning tea, Ju-young with a fruit plate she had not touched, Hyun-woo with his phone face down on the tablecloth in the way that men put their phones face down when they are expecting a message they don't want witnessed, Baek standing near the service door, 2 of the distant relatives who apparently had nowhere else to be, a junior household staff member who froze in the act of pouring orange juice into a glass that was already full. 7 people. 7 faces making 7 versions of the same recalibration, the rapid, disorienting work of a mind that has built a complete picture of its current situation and has just been told, by the opening of a door, that the picture was wrong. Hyun-woo recovered first. That was telling. He picked up his phone from the table, not checking it, just holding it, and he said with remarkable composure, "You came back early." "I didn't leave," Min-jae said. The orange juice was still pouring. The junior staff member finally registered it and pulled the pitcher back, and the small domestic absurdity of it. The brief overflow. The junior staff member reaching for a cloth with shaking hands was the only movement in the room for approximately 3 seconds. Sun-hee set her teacup down. The sound it made against the saucer was very precise, very controlled, the sound of a woman who is reaching for the thing that has always worked for her, composure, and finding it, just barely. "Min-jae, when did you—" "The flight was grounded," he said. He walked to the head of the table. He did not sit. He stood at the head, in the space his chair occupied, and he looked at each face in sequence, not quickly, not as a performance, but with the thorough attention of someone taking inventory. There was a security threat. I came back through the concealed corridor, and I stayed in the security room below the estate. He let that sit. Ju-young made a small sound, not quite a word, not quite a breath, something in between. "I was there," Min-jae continued, in the same level register, "for approximately 22 hours. Hyun-woo was very still now. His phone was in his hand and his hand was resting on the tablecloth, and he was looking at Min-jae with the specific quality of attention that a person gives a situation when they are simultaneously processing several catastrophic implications at once and trying to determine which one to address first. He was not quite pale. He was working very hard at not being pale. Min-jae reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small remote. He held it up without particular ceremony and pressed the single button on it. Every screen in the dining hall came on simultaneously. The estate had 4 mounted displays in the formal dining room, installed 2 years ago for presentations during business dinners. A practical addition that Min Jae had approved without any anticipation of this particular use. All 4 screens activated at once, and all 4 showed the same feed, and the feed was time-stamped from the previous evening, and the first thing everyone heard was Sun Hee's own voice coming from the speakers embedded in the walls of her son's dining room. The wife doesn't know how to hold chopsticks correctly. The room did not react loudly. That was the thing about a room full of people who have been caught. They don't make noise. They get very quiet and very small, each person separately, each person becoming an island in the space between them. The distant relatives at the far end of the table were looking at the screen with the expressions of people who have just been reminded, in the most concrete possible way, that the rooms they move through are not as private as they believed. The footage ran. Min Jae watched the room watch itself. He watched his mother's face as her own voice played back to her, not just the chopsticks comment, but the dining room exchange, the corridor scene, the winter garden audio, with its 30-second delay rendered perfectly in the estate's acoustic system. He watched the moment she heard Nia's voice from the winter garden, the whispered words, the "I'm not going to tell him because I refuse to be the reason he turns against his own family." And he watched something happen to Sun Hee's face that he had not expected to see. Not shame, exactly. Something more complicated than shame. Something that had the shape of a woman confronting the gap between the story she told herself about her own actions and the reality of those actions rendered in audio and light. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds, and then her composure came back down over it like a curtain, but he had seen it. He had seen it. The corridor footage played. The necklace. The sound of it hitting the floor. Hyun-woo's voice. Accident. Beck's service corridor meeting. The audio. The specific phrasing. She has no authority once the boss leaves. Played without comment from anyone. The kitchen exchange, the staff communication board, the camera tight enough on the writing that the 6 words were readable on all 4 screens simultaneously. Mrs. Brooks has no authority here. Hyun-woo pushed back from the table. This is... He started. Sit down, Min Jae said. The 2 words were spoken at the same volume as everything else he'd said since he walked in. No louder. No particular edge in the delivery. And Hyun-woo sat down because the thing that had made Kang Min Jae what he was not volume, and it was not visible aggression. It was the quality of absolute certainty that lived in very quiet instructions. The footage continued for 4 more minutes. When it ended, the screens went dark. The room was completely silent except for the sound of the junior staff member's feet as she quietly, very quietly, removed herself to the service door. Beck had not moved from his position near the wall. He was looking at a fixed point somewhere between the floor and the middle distance. His face had the expression of a man who has arrived at a reckoning he understood was coming and has decided too late that he should have made a different choice somewhere earlier. Min Jae reached into his jacket's inside pocket and removed the divorce agreement, the multi-page document his mother had presented in the corridor the previous evening. He held it up so the table could see it. Then he tore it. Not dramatically, not in the single cinematic tear that resolves in a shower of paper. He tore it methodically, page by page, the way you destroy a document you want to make absolutely certain cannot be reassembled. And he placed the pieces on the table directly in front of his mother's teacup. Min Jae, Sun Hee said. Her voice was controlled. Barely. I'm going to speak now, he said. I'm going to say specific things to specific people, and I'm going to say them once. He looked at Beck first. You've worked in this household for 14 years. In those 14 years, you have received 1 instruction from me regarding the authority structure of this estate. 1. My wife's instructions carry my authority. That instruction has not changed, and it did not change because I boarded a car for the airport. He paused. You're dismissed from the household. You'll receive severance consistent with your tenure. You'll be escorted out this morning. Beck opened his mouth. Closed it, nodded once, the nod of a man receiving something he has no standing to refuse. Min Jae turned to the distant relatives at the far end of the table. Your access to the estate, to the family accounts, and to any organizational resource is suspended effective this morning. You'll have until noon to collect personal belongings. One of them, the older one, a man named Yoon who had attached himself to Sun Hee's orbit for as long as Min Jae could remember, said, On what basis? On the basis that I watched you sit at that table last night and say nothing. Minji's voice stayed level. Silence in a room like that is a position. You took a position. You can take it somewhere else. He looked at Ju Young. His aunt had not spoken since he walked in. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes slightly downcast, and the expression of a woman running internal calculations about what exactly she could credibly claim she had or had not participated in. Ju Young, I know you didn't prepare the document. I know you didn't touch the necklace. I also know you sat through every minute of last night and offered nothing. He looked at her for a moment. Your access to the main estate is suspended for 6 months. We'll revisit it after that. Ju Young's eyes came up. She looked at him and then at Nia, who had come through the dining hall doors 30 seconds after Min-jae and had been standing near the east wall in the specific posture of a woman who was exactly where she chose to be. Not behind him, not beside him, in a way that looked curated, just present, in the room, watching. And then Ju Young looked back down at her hands. I'm sorry, she said, very quietly. Nia said nothing. She did not need to. Min-jae turned to Hyun-woo. Hyun-woo was sitting with both hands flat on the table now, and his jaw set, and his eyes doing the rapid work of a man assembling a defense in real time. He was 34 years old, and he had grown up in the peripheral warmth of this family's power, and he had learned to navigate it by being useful when usefulness was valued and by being invisible when visibility was dangerous. And he had at some point made the specific error of confusing navigation with entitlement, of believing that proximity to power was a form of claim on it. The Singapore allocation, Min-jae said. 2 years. Just under 3 million. Hyun-woo said nothing. The private security contractor. The Fujimoto network proxy. The holding company with the Gala contract. Min-jae watched his cousin's face. The threat that grounded my flight. Hyun-woo said very carefully, you can't prove. Byung-soo's team has been working since 2 in the morning. Min-jae reached into his jacket and placed a printed document on the table. 12 pages of financial mapping, clean, precise, the kind of document that had been prepared by someone who understood both the material and the audience. 47 transfers, 3 shell structures, 1 contractor with a direct payment chain to a cell that's been on our watch list for 14 months. He slid the document across the table. I can prove considerably more than you'd like. Hyun-woo looked at the document. He did not touch it. You were going to use the Gala, Min-jae said. The room was so quiet now that the sound of his own voice felt excessive. You'd paid for access to a room where Nia would be in public. 400 guests, chaos in a controlled space. He paused. What was the instruction? Remove her entirely? Or just create a situation that required it? You're building a narrative, Hyun-woo. The name came out like a door closing. I have the wire transfers, I have the contractor's payment records, I have the cell tower data from your call yesterday, and the location of the phone you called it to. I have 17 months of financial extraction from accounts you had provisional access to for operational purposes. He straightened. I have everything. So what I'd like from you now, the only thing I want from you in this room, is confirmation of one thing. Hyun-woo looked at him. His face had finally gone the color Min-jae had been expecting. Not pale, but drained, the specific flatness of a face that has given up the performance of composure and has nothing underneath it. Was it about the organization? Min-jae said. Or was it about me? Silence. Because if it was about the organization, if there is a legitimate structural argument you've been trying to make about the direction or leadership of this operation, then there is a process for that. There has always been a process. You knew that. He waited. But if it was about me, if this started because you wanted what I built, and you thought the way to get it was to take apart everything He stopped himself, breathed once. Tell me which one it was. Hyun-woo looked at the financial document on the table. He looked at the 4 dark screens. He looked at the pieces of the torn divorce agreement scattered in front of his aunt's teacup. And then, in the way that people sometimes tell the truth, not because they've chosen honesty, but because every alternative has become more costly than the truth, he said, both. The word landed in the room like a stone into still water, the ripples moving outward in all directions simultaneously. Sun-hee made a small sound. Not words, just a sound. Both, Min-jae repeated quietly. You were going to waste it, Hyun-woo said, And something had cracked open in his voice now, something that had been pressurized behind the composure for a very long time. Everything this family built, everything grandfather built, you were going to dilute it, restructure it, hand pieces of it to... He stopped. His eyes went briefly to Nia and then back to Min-jae with the specific quality of a man who knows the sentence he's about to complete is going to confirm everything already on the screens. Say it, Nia said from the east wall. The room turned. She had been so still that several people had stopped accounting for her presence, which was exactly what she had intended. She was standing with her hands at her sides, and her voice was not loud and not aggressive. It was simply there, in the room, asking a question that the room needed answered. Say what you were going to say, she said to Hyunwoo. Finish the sentence. Hyunwoo looked at her. Something moved through his expression. Not remorse, not quite, but the specific discomfort of a man being asked to be precise about something he had always kept usefully vague. I meant the direction of the organization. You meant me, she said. Say it. He looked at her for a long moment. I thought you were a liability, he said finally. I thought you were something he'd chosen without understanding the cost of it. I thought, he exhaled, I thought if you were gone, he'd see clearly again. Nia looked at him. The room was completely still. And the gala, she said. Hyunwoo's jaw tightened. The gala, Hyunwoo, she said again. Same register, same absolute stillness. He looked at the table. The contractor had instructions to create an incident. What kind of incident? Silence. What kind of incident, she said for the third time. And this time Min-jae heard something in her voice that he had not heard before. Not anger, not fear, but the cold, clarifying register of a woman who has decided that she is going to stand in this room until she has every answer this room contains. An abduction scenario, Hyunwoo said. Staged. The intent was, it was supposed to look like a threat against the family, something that created enough disruption that the captains would question Min-jae's ability to secure his own household. Not, he stopped. Not harm me, Nia said, or not permanently. Hyunwoo said nothing, which was its own answer. Min-jae moved. He crossed the room in 4 steps, and he took Hyunwoo by the collar of his jacket, not striking him, just taking hold, the controlled grip of a man who is making a physical statement rather than inflicting damage. And he said very quietly, 2 inches from his cousin's face, the contractor, the name. Hyunwoo's hands came up, not defensive, surrendering. Lee, he said, operating under the name Lee. Sung-il will know the network. Min-jae held him for another moment. Then he released him and stepped back and straightened his jacket with the specific deliberateness of a man returning to himself from somewhere very close to a line he had decided in advance not to cross. He turned to Sung-il, who had been standing near the service door since the screens came on. Find the contractor, he said. Now, before the gala prep team has access to the estate. Sung-il was already on his phone walking out. The room exhaled. It was a collective thing. Not relief, not resolution, just the particular release of air that a room makes when the moment of maximum pressure has passed its peak, and whatever comes next is going to be different from what just happened, whatever it is. Sun-hee had not spoken since Min-jae said her son's name at the head of the table. She sat with her hands in her lap and her morning tea cooling in front of her, and the pieces of the dissolved divorce agreement scattered on the tablecloth. And she looked at her son with an expression that had layers to it Min-jae didn't have time to fully inventory. He looked at her and she looked back at him. And between them was 18 months of a silence that should have been a conversation, and all the things that silence had allowed to grow in its absence. Min-jae, she said. Not now, mother, he said, quietly, firmly. The way you say something to someone you are not done with but are also not ready for. The postponement that is not avoidance but timing. We'll talk. Not in front of the household. She pressed her lips together and nodded once. He turned back to the table. To the room. To all of it. The organizational access, he said, and this was addressed not to the people physically present but to the structure itself, to the invisible architecture of accounts and authorities and residences and security provisions that the Kang organization extended to its family members. Hyunwoo's access to every organizational resource, financial, operational, residential, security, is revoked effective this moment. His position as a family representative in any organizational context is dissolved. He looked at his cousin. You'll be escorted to your rooms. You'll collect what's yours. You'll have until noon. Hyun-woo sat very still. The captains will be briefed before the end of the day, Min-jae continued. The full financial audit will be made available to the senior leadership. Any captain who wants to review Byung-soo's documentation can do so through Kim Dong-hyun's office. He paused. There won't be questions about succession. There will be answers about theft. That last sentence was the only one that carried anything close to heat. Everything else had been delivered at the same controlled temperature as the first word he'd said when he walked in. But that one, there will be answers about theft, had something underneath it that everyone in the room could feel, the way you feel a current in water before you can see it moving. Hyun-woo stood up, his chair scraped back. He looked at Min-jae for a moment with an expression that had too many things in it to name. And then he looked at Nia, and whatever he was going to say, whatever last thing was assembling itself in the wreckage of the morning, he apparently decided not to say it. He walked out. The room was different after he left. Not lighter, that wasn't the word. Just different. The shape of it had changed with one person gone from it, the way the balance of any space shifts when a load-bearing element is removed. Min-jae looked at Nia. She was still standing near the east wall. She was not performing anything. She was just standing there, in the room where all of it had just happened, with the necklace at her throat and her hands at her sides and the particular expression of a person who has survived something they expected to be worse than it was and is still taking inventory of what they feel about that. He walked to her. She didn't move toward him, and she didn't step back. She waited, with the stillness that he had spent 22 hours watching from below, and that he understood now was not passivity, but its opposite. The stillness of a person who has decided exactly where they are going to stand and is standing there. He stopped in front of her. You have questions, he said. Still, yes. I know. He looked at her. I meant what I said upstairs. All of it. I know you did. She looked back at him. That doesn't make the question smaller. No, he agreed. It doesn't. They stood like that for a moment. Two people in a room that was slowly reorienting itself around a new reality. The household staff, who hadn't been dismissed, moving quietly at the edges. Sun-hee still at the table with her cooling tea, the 4 screens dark on the walls. All of it present, none of it resolved. The difference between the morning that had started and the morning they were in now was the specific difference between a fire that is still burning and a fire that has found its final perimeter, still hot, still dangerous in all the ways that heat is dangerous, but no longer spreading in every direction at once. And then Sung-il's voice came through Min-jae's earpiece, clipped, immediate, the voice of a man reporting something that requires action faster than the action can be organized. Min-jae's hand went to his ear. Say that again, he said. The gray Jeep, Sung-il said. We found it. It's not on the access road. It's inside the perimeter. East Service Gate came through on a vendor credential that was issued for the gala prep. The credential was issued by Baek 3 weeks ago. Min-jae was already moving. The contractor is on the estate, Sung-il said. Right now. Nia had watched his face change, and she already knew, not the specifics, but the shape of it, the shift in his body, the way his entire bearing reorganized itself from the controlled stillness of a man who has just concluded one confrontation into the alert, kinetic readiness of a man who has just been told a different confrontation has already begun without him. Min-jae, she said. He turned back to her. How many? He said into the earpiece. We're counting, Sung-il said. At least 4, maybe 6. They came in with equipment cases. Gala setup, they'd have passed any standard credential check. We didn't pull Beck's vendor list until the ballroom, Min-jae said. They'll stage from the ballroom. It's the only space with enough access points. He was moving through the dining hall toward the corridor, and the room was reacting to him moving, Ju-young pushing back from the table, one of the remaining relatives standing without knowing why, Sun-hee rising with her hand on the back of her chair and her voice sharp. Min-jae? What? He did not stop. He was in the corridor. Nia was beside him. She had not waited for an invitation. She had simply moved when he moved, and he registered this without comment because there was no time for comment, and because she had told him, upstairs, in the gray morning light, that she was not something that needed to be managed. Sung-il, he said, I need a team on the East Service corridor and I need the ballroom sealed. Nobody goes in or out. I have 2 men at the ballroom entrance. The rest of my team is a sound from the direction of the ballroom. Not a shot, not yet, but something that preceded shots in the specific acoustic sequence that Min Jae had learned in rooms very different from this one. The sound of equipment being moved with urgency, the sound of men repositioning, the compressed and purposeful sound of people who had a plan and had just understood that someone knew about the plan. Min Jae stopped in the east corridor. He looked at Nia. She was looking back at him with clear eyes. Not calm, that would be dishonest. Her pulse was visible in her throat, and her breathing had the particular shallowness of a person whose body has understood the situation faster than their mind has finished processing it, but present. She was there. Entirely, deliberately there. "The security room," he said. "Sublevel. The corridor behind the laundry." "I know where it is," she said. He looked at her for half a second. "Sungil's second team will meet you there." "And you?" He held her gaze. "I'm going to the ballroom," he said. Something moved across her face. She reached out and her hand found the lapel of his jacket. Not grabbing, not pulling, just contact, her fingers against the fabric for 1 second. He put his hand over hers for that same second. Then she let go. "Come back," she said. He turned and moved toward the ballroom, and the corridor behind him was empty except for the sound of her moving in the other direction, quick, purposeful. The footsteps of a woman who had just heard the word go in every possible register and had understood all of them. The ballroom doors were 40 feet ahead. One of Sung-il's men was at the left door with his back against the wall and his hand up, 4 fingers, the count signal, meaning 4 confirmed inside. Min Jae reached him in 12 steps and took the sidearm the man held out to him without breaking stride and checked it in the motion of a man for whom checking a weapon is a reflex that does not require conscious attention. Through the ballroom doors he could hear movement, furniture being shifted, something heavy being dragged across the parquet floor, the specific sounds of people who knew their window was closing. Min Jae looked at the guard. The guard looked back. Min Jae pushed the door. The ballroom was enormous, the estate's largest room, 30 meters of polished floor and floor-to-ceiling windows along the north face. The chandeliers that Nia had redesigned the hanging hardware for 6 months ago, still perfect overhead. The room set for nothing yet, bare and vast in the morning light. 4 men in gray coveralls were positioned around the room's perimeter in the specific configuration of people who had entered with a cover story and have abandoned it. Equipment cases, large, metal-sided, the kind used for event AV equipment, were open near the west wall. The cases were not holding AV equipment. The man nearest the west wall turned first. He was large, professional in the specific way that private contractors are professional. Economical, attentive, the kind of large that is not bulk but organization, everything in the body positioned for use. He looked at Min Jae in the doorway, and he made the same calculation Min Jae was making, and he reached for the case beside him. Min Jae moved. The distance between the door and the west wall was 18 meters. He covered 12 of it before the man at the case had it fully open. And the reason he could cover 12 meters that quickly was the same reason he had survived every situation in his adult life that required covering distance quickly. He did not telegraph, he did not hesitate, and he had spent enough time in enough rooms like this one to understand that the first 2 seconds of a confrontation are not the time for assessment, they are the time for commitment. He took the man's arm before the weapon cleared the case. The sound they made was not cinematic. It was the sound of 2 large bodies making contact with the specific efficiency of serious violence. Short, sharp, functional, nothing wasted. The man was trained. Min Jae was better. The distinction mattered, and the distinction resolved itself in approximately 4 seconds. And Min Jae came out of those 4 seconds with a cut across his left palm from where the case edge had caught him, and the man in the gray coverall was on the floor in a position that would keep him there. The other 3 had moved. 1 toward the north windows, 1 toward the service entrance on the east side, 1 toward Min Jae. Sung-il's team came through the service entrance simultaneously. 2 men, fast, coordinated. The kind of coordination that comes from years of working together in bad situations. And the one moving toward the east was handled before he reached the door. The one at the north windows had a phone in his hand. He was not moving toward Min Jae. He was standing at the window, and he was looking at the phone, and he was pressing something on it, and Min Jae understood in the fraction of a second that he had to cross 16 meters before whatever was on that phone reached whatever it was being sent to. He was not going to make it in time. He raised the weapon instead. "Put it down," he said. The man at the window looked at him. He was younger than the others, mid-20s, the kind of young that ends up in situations like this because someone much older and much more careful made it seem like a reasonable choice at the time. He looked at Min-jae with the phone still in his hand and the specific expression of someone who is doing the math on two very bad options. "Put it down," Min-jae said again. The man with the phone looked at the screen, looked at Min-jae, and then he put the phone on the floor and raised his hands, and Min-jae crossed the room and picked it up and looked at the screen. The message had not sent. The signal in this part of the ballroom, thick stone walls, north-facing, the dead zone that the estate's Wi-Fi had always had trouble reaching and that the tech team had simply stopped trying to fix, had not been enough to push the transmission through. Min-jae looked at the unsent message. A single word, proceed. He looked at the man who had been about to send it. "Proceed to what?" he said. The young man's hands were still up. He was breathing hard. He looked at Min-jae and he looked at the phone and he made the third option calculation, the one that younger men sometimes find that older men have already closed off, and he decided to say nothing. Min-jae looked at the phone. He looked at the contact the message had been addressed to. It was not a number he recognized, but beside the number, in the contact name field, was two letters, HW Hyun-woo. Min-jae stood in the middle of the ballroom with the phone in his cut hand and the four men in gray coveralls dealt with, either on the floor or in Sung-il's team's control, and he looked at those two letters and understood that the morning was not finished, that Hyun-woo had not simply walked out of the dining hall to collect his things, that a man who had spent 2 years building this had not walked out of a room with nowhere to go next. He pressed the call button. It rang once. It rang twice. On the third ring, from somewhere above him, from the direction of the second floor, from the residential wing where Hyun-woo had been told to go and collect his personal belongings, he heard a phone ring. And then he heard, from the same direction, a door. And then he heard, from the same direction, fast footsteps in the corridor above the ballroom ceiling, moving not toward the main staircase but toward the east passage, the passage that connected, through the second-floor linen corridor, to the service staircase that came down behind the laundry anteroom, the same route Min-jae had used to move through his own house in the dark, the route he had shown Nia that morning, the route that ended at the sub-level corridor entrance behind the laundry, the same corridor where Sung-il's second team was supposed to be meeting Nia. Min-jae was already running. He took the stairs 3 at a time. Not because he was panicking. Panic was a luxury he had trained out of himself at 23 years old in a room considerably less comfortable than this staircase, but because the math was simple and the math was bad. Hyun-woo had a head start measured in seconds, not minutes, and seconds in a corridor with a known endpoint were the difference between an interception and an arrival, and Min-jae could not afford to arrive after. He hit the second-floor landing and turned east without breaking stride, and the linen corridor was exactly as it always was, narrow, white-walled, the overhead lights on their motion sensors flickering on as he moved through, and at the far end the door to the service staircase was already swinging closed behind someone who had just gone through it. Min-jae hit the door with his shoulder and went through and took the service stairs down 2 at a time, his left hand leaving a smear of blood on the wall where the cut from the equipment case caught the surface, and he could hear footsteps below him. Faster than he'd expected, Hyun-woo was running with the specific urgency of a man who understood exactly what he'd set in motion and needed to reach it before it was stopped. The service staircase bottomed out in the laundry anteroom. Min-jae came through the bottom door 4 seconds behind the man he was chasing and found the laundry anteroom empty. The door to the sub-level corridor was ajar. He went through it. The sub-level corridor was 40 meters of concrete and fluorescent lighting and the particular cold that underground passages hold, regardless of the season above them. At the far end, where the corridor opened into the security room junction, he could see 2 things simultaneously. Sung-il's second team, 2 men, both on the floor, both moving, neither incapacitated, but both clearly having just been knocked aside with the efficiency of someone who had studied this corridor's layout and planned for the people who would be in it, and Hyun-woo, 30 meters ahead, with his hand on Nia's arm. Not a weapon. That was the first thing Min-jae registered. No visible weapon. Just his hand on her arm and her body turned toward him with a stillness that Min-jae recognized from 40 hours of watching her navigate bad rooms. The stillness of a woman who is assessing, not frozen, who is buying time by not escalating, who is doing the thing she had done all her life, which was to stay exactly where she was and be more solid than whatever was trying to move her. Hyun-woo. Min-jae's voice came out even. I was breathing hard from the stairs, but his voice had found its register and was staying there. Let go of her. Hyun-woo turned. His face was different from the dining room. The composure was completely gone now, not replaced by rage, but by something rawer and less organized. The expression of a man who has watched 2 years of careful construction collapse in a single morning and is operating now on something closer to instinct than strategy. His hand did not release Nia's arm. The message didn't go through, Min-jae said, walking forward, closing the distance at a pace that was deliberate, fast enough to communicate that it was going to be closed, slow enough not to trigger the specific kind of panic that does unpredictable things to unsteady people. The contractor's team is contained. Sung-il has them. He kept his eyes on Hyun-woo's face. There's nothing left to proceed to. You don't know what I have left, Hyun-woo said. I know what you don't have. Min-jae was 20 meters away now. You don't have the organization, you don't have the captains, you don't have the financial access, the security team, or the legal cover. 15 meters. What you have is a corridor and a woman whose arm you're holding, and that is not a position. That is the end of a position. Hyun-woo looked at him, and then looked at Nia, and something moved through his face. Not calculation, not the thing Min-jae had been watching all morning, but something underneath calculation, something that had been there before the planning and the wire transfers and the 2 years of careful construction. Something that looked, if Min-jae was being honest about what he was seeing, like the specific anguish of a person who has made a series of choices that seemed logical in sequence and has arrived at the end of that sequence in a concrete corridor holding a woman's arm and understood, finally, that logic and rightness are not the same thing. Nia was looking at Hyun-woo, not at Min-jae, at Hyun-woo. You can let go, she said quietly. Hyun-woo looked at her, something about the directness of it, the absence of fear in her voice, the fact that she was looking at him like he was a person rather than a threat, seemed to land differently than anything else that had happened in the last 60 seconds. None of this made you right, she said, but it also doesn't have to end here, not like this. His hand released her arm. It was not dramatic. It was the way things end when they are genuinely over, not with a climactic gesture, but with a simple physical fact, a hand opening, the absence of grip. He stepped back and his back found the corridor wall, and he slid down it until he was sitting on the concrete floor with his knees up and his hands between them, and his head dropped forward, and he stayed like that. Sung-il's men were on their feet. They moved to Hyun-woo, and he did not resist. He went with them the way people go when they have run out of directions to go in, which is quietly and without argument. All the energy that had been spent on forward motion now simply gone. Min-jae reached Nia. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her arm where Hyun-woo's hand had been. No visible mark, no injury. And then he looked at her face. She was looking back at him with the same clear eyes she'd had upstairs that morning, and underneath the clarity, he could see the thing that the clarity was covering, the way you can see the structure of a building through its facade if you know what you're looking for, the cost of the last hour, the specific exhaustion of a person who has held themselves together through more than holding together should require. Are you hurt? He said. No, she said. He exhaled. It was not a performative exhale. It was the breath of a man who has been holding something very tightly for a very long time and has just been given the specific permission of a single word to release it. He stood in the concrete corridor with the fluorescent light overhead and the blood drying on his left hand, and he breathed out, and he looked at his wife and he said nothing else, because there was nothing else that needed to be said in this particular moment. Some moments are complete without language, and this was one of them. Nia looked at his hand. You're bleeding, she said. I know. We should... In a minute, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The corridor was cold and the light was too harsh, and it was not the location either of them would have chosen for the moment, after everything, but moments don't wait for the right location. They arrive where they arrive. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, not gently, not softly, in the way the gesture is usually described, but with the specific pressure of someone making contact with something real, confirming it's there. He put his hand over hers and held it there for a moment, the way he'd held it upstairs that morning. Then Sung-il's voice came from the far end of the corridor. We need to move the contractor's team before the household staff has more access to the lower level, he said. He had the professional tact of a man who understood what he was interrupting and was interrupting it anyway because the situation required it. And Kim Dong-hyun is at the East Gate. He drove himself. Min-jae took his hand down. Nia took hers down. All right, Min-jae said, and they walked back through the corridor together toward whatever came next. What came next took most of the day. Kim Dong-hyun spent 3 hours in the estate's ground floor conference room with Byung-soo's complete financial audit, 2 senior captains who had driven in from their respective positions across the city, and a representative from the legitimate business division who had been briefed by phone at 7 that morning and had arrived at 9 with the expression of a woman who had been doing this long enough to be unsurprised, but was not yet at the point of being unaffected. Min-jae sat in on the first hour and then removed himself, because the legal and organizational mechanics required people who were not the subject of the situation to manage them objectively, and he had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing a man in his position could do was to be present for processes that needed to run without him. He went to the kitchen instead. Hye-jin was there, the young staff member who had put the coffee on the counter without being asked, the small act that Nia had noticed and Min-jae had watched from the monitor and had catalogued as evidence of something the house contained that the past 24 hours had not managed to destroy. She looked up when he came in and then looked at his hand. The cut had been wrapped with a bandage from the first aid kit in the security room, adequate but not elegant, and she said nothing, which was exactly the right response. He made coffee. He did it himself, which was not usual, and which Hye-jin navigated by becoming extremely interested in the produce delivery she was sorting at the far end of the counter. He made 2 cups, the way Nia took hers and the way he took his, and he carried them upstairs. Nia was in her studio. The light was on. Of course it was on. It was always on. And when he knocked, she said, "Come in," and he came in and set the coffee on the corner of the drafting table that was clear and pulled the chair from the small sitting area in the corner and sat down near her. She was working. Not because she was unaffected, he could see the afternoon's residue in the set of her shoulders, in the way she was holding the pencil slightly tighter than her usual grip, but because working was the thing she did with difficult things, the way some people talk and some people sleep and some people run. Nia drew. She always had. He had understood this about her early, in the first months, and had understood that the sketchbook under her arm was not an affectation but a load-bearing element of how she moved through the world. He sat with his coffee and let her work without asking what she was drawing. After a while she said without looking up, "Soul." "Yes," he said. She drew another line. "Tell me everything." So he did. He told her the full version, not the compressed morning version he'd given her in the bedroom before the dining room, but the real version. The version with the specific texture of a 31-year-old man being told by his mother that a particular alliance was what the organization required, and the way he had said, "I need time," and meant it as a maybe and let it sit as a maybe, because confronting it directly would have required a conversation he hadn't been ready for. He told her about meeting her 4 months later and understanding in a way that was not a decision, but a fact that the maybe was no longer a maybe, and his failure to close the door formally, because closing it formally would have made it an argument, and he had always preferred to let things dissolve rather than to dismantle them. "That's a pattern," she said. "I know," he said. "It's the same pattern that let this morning happen." "I know." She looked up from the sketchbook then. She looked at him with the directness she always had, the thing that had stopped him the first time he saw it, the quality of looking at a person without flinching from what you find. And she said, "I need you to understand that I am not angry about Soul. The arrangement, the family, all of that. I understand how those things work, and I understand the position you were in." She paused. "What I'm angry about is the not telling." "Yes," he said, "because the not telling is what gave your mother the room to do what she did last night. She used something real. It was distorted and weaponized and used badly, but there was a real thing underneath it." Nia set the pencil down. "And I was in that study having a conversation I didn't have the full information to navigate." "You navigated it fine," he said. "That's not the point." "I know," he said. "It's not the point." She picked the pencil back up. Not to draw, just to have something to hold. "I need to know that this kind of silence isn't going to be how we work." "It won't be," he said. He said it without the particular emphasis that people use when they are trying to be convincing rather than true. He said it the way he said the things he meant, which was without decoration, because decoration was what he added when he was performing. and the woman across the drafting table from him had proven, in the last 36 hours, to be the least performable at person he had ever encountered. She looked at him for a long moment, then she nodded once. Not forgiveness, that was not a thing that happened in a single nod, but acknowledgement, the recognition of something said and received. "Okay," she said. She went back to drawing. He drank his coffee and watched her work, and the studio was warm and the light was good, and outside the windows the Seattle afternoon was doing what Seattle afternoons did in November. Gray, layered, a particular kind of beautiful that required a specific tolerance for imperfection to appreciate. The meeting in the conference room lasted until 4:15. Kim Dong-hyun came upstairs at 4:30 with the organized calm of an attorney who has spent a long afternoon in a difficult room and has found, at the end of it, a workable outcome. He sat across from Min Jae in the study. Min Jae's study, which smelled like itself again, the cedar and tea, and the particular accumulated presence of a man who had spent real time in a room. And he laid out the situation with the precision of someone who charges by the hour and understands that clarity is the most respectful form the bill can take. The financial case against Hyun-woo was complete. 47 transfers, 3 shell structures, the contractor connection with direct payment evidence, and the gala access credential issued through BAC that tied the physical component of the morning's events to the same financial network. The organizational captains had reviewed Byung-soo's documentation and had reached a unanimous position within 90 minutes of receiving it. Park Hyun-woo was expelled from the organization permanently. His access to all organizational resources, financial, operational, residential, was dissolved. His personal accounts, to the extent they contained identifiable organizational funds, would be subject to recovery proceedings. The private security contractor and associated personnel would be referred to Sung-il's network for appropriate handling outside of legal channels, which Min Jae noted and did not comment on because there were aspects of the world he operated in that required a different kind of resolution than the kind courts were designed to provide. "Baek?" Min Jae asked. "Household matter rather than organizational. His departure stands." Dong-hyun folded his hands. He cooperated fully this afternoon. Everything he knew about the vendor credential and the gala access arrangement is documented. He didn't know what the access was for. He believed it was a favor to Hyun-woo regarding gala logistics. That may or may not be accurate. Does it change his situation? Not materially. Min Jae nodded. "Your mother," Dong-hyun said. He said it carefully, with the care of a man who has known his client for 12 years and understands the geography of the things he is careful about. Legally, she has no exposure. The divorce agreement was prepared by a family-retained firm, presented privately, never executed. It's not actionable. A pause. Organizationally, the captains are aware of her involvement. The consensus was that it falls within family matters rather than organizational conduct. And personally, Min Jae said. Dong-hyun did not answer that one because it was not a legal question, and he was a lawyer, and the boundary between the professional and the personal was one he had maintained for 12 years because it was what made him useful. "I'll handle it personally," Min Jae said. Dong-hyun gathered his documents. "One more thing. The Park family in Seoul." He said it without inflection, the tone of a man raising a line item. "You indicated this morning that you wanted the prior conversation formally dissolved. I can prepare the appropriate communication." "Do it," Min Jae said. "Today." "Understood." Dong-hyun left. Min Jae sat in the study for a while after he left. In the chair behind his desk with the brushed steel penholder Nia had given him directly in front of him, and he thought about the particular quality of the afternoon, the way a day that has contained the kind of morning this one had contained settles into its later hours with a specific weight, not heavy in the way that pain is heavy, but heavy in the way that significance is heavy, the weight of a thing that has changed shape permanently and will never fit back into the space it occupied before. He thought about his mother. That was the part he had been not thinking about all day, in the way you don't think about the hardest thing while you're handling the things around it, and now that the things around it were handled, there was nothing left to not think about. He found her in the east sitting room at 5 o'clock. She was alone. Ju-young had retreated to her rooms in the west wing, and the house had the particular spaciousness of a place that has had several of its usual occupants removed from it simultaneously. A feeling not unlike the first day after a long illness, when you realize the rooms you'd forgotten about exist again. Sun-hee was sitting by the window with a book open in her lap that she was not reading. She looked up when he came in, and she looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face in a very long time. Not since he was a child, actually. Not since the years before the organization consumed everything, including the way families in it related to each other. The expression of a mother who is looking at her son and seeing her son rather than the position her son occupies. He sat down across from her. They were quiet for a moment. "Hyun-woo," she said finally. "Yes." "I didn't know." She said it directly, without the diplomatic cushioning she usually brought to difficult statements. "About the contractor, the gala. I want you to know that." "I believe you," he said. And he did. The morning's full picture had made clear that Hyun-woo had kept the operational layer entirely separate from what he'd allowed Sun-hee to see, which was the version where family pressure and legal procedure accomplished the goal without anything that required explaining afterward. "I knew about the document," she said. "I knew about the conversation with the Seoul family. I knew about—" She stopped, looked at her hands. "I believed I was protecting something." "What?" She looked up. "You. The organization. The things that last past any individual." She paused. "I told myself Nia was temporary. I told myself you had made a decision without fully understanding its consequences and that I was helping you correct it." A long pause. "I told myself a great many things." "And now?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, outside the east windows. The November afternoon was going dark early, the way it did, the city's lights beginning to surface through the gray. "I heard her," she said. "In the garden. On those screens this morning." She pressed her lips together. "She whispered that she would not tell you because she refused to be the reason you turned against your family." Min-jae said nothing. "I have spent 18 months, Sun-hee said slowly, treating that woman as if she were a problem to be solved. And she spent those same 18 months protecting you from me." She looked at her son. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to know tonight," he said. "Min-jae, mother." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. "I'm not asking you to understand it tonight. I'm not asking you to make peace with everything that happened in a single afternoon." He looked at her. "But I'm telling you that my marriage is not a discussion. It has never been a discussion, and it will not become one." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said, very quietly. "I know that now." He sat with her for another 20 minutes. They talked about nothing significant, about Ju Young's situation, about the estate's schedule for the coming weeks, about a minor logistical matter regarding one of the legitimate businesses that required his signature. The ordinary texture of things, laid carefully over the top of what had just been acknowledged, the way families sometimes have to do it. The heavy conversation concluded, the ordinary conversation resumed, both of them understanding that the heavy conversation is not finished, but that finishing it will take longer than an afternoon and will have to happen in the accumulation of many smaller moments rather than a single resolution. He left her at the window with her unread book, and he went to find Nia. She was in the winter garden. Of course she was in the winter garden. It was her room in this house, in the way that no other room was, the one she had found and claimed not formally, but through the simple repeated fact of being there, the way people claim the places that feel like them. She was in the corner by the Japanese maples, the corner where the camera he hadn't told her about had picked up her whispered words the night before. And she was sitting on the stone bench with her sketchbook, and she had the necklace at her throat, and she was looking up at the glass ceiling. Min-jae came in and sat beside her on the stone bench. She did not look at him immediately. She looked up at the glass ceiling, at the November sky above it, the dark coming down, and the Seattle lights beginning to compete with the last of the daylight. "I used to do this in Chicago," she said. "Find the highest window in whatever building I was in, and look up." She paused. "My grandmother said I was always trying to see what was above the ceiling. She said I'd been like that since I was small." He looked up too. The glass ceiling held the sky imperfectly, the way glass always does, fragmented, refracted, the image true but not seamless. "What are you drawing?" he said. She turned the sketchbook so he could see. It was the community center, the Rainier Valley project. He recognized the footprint from the rendering she'd shown him months ago. But this was different from those renderings. Those had been professional, precise, the drawings of an architect presenting work to clients and contractors. This one had the quality of something drawn for herself, looser, more alive, the lines confident without being rigid, the spaces between the lines doing as much work as the lines themselves. In the central courtyard, which had been an open rectangle in the professional renderings, she had drawn children. Not detailed, just the suggestion of children, the gestural shorthand of figures in motion, running and climbing and occupying the space the way children occupy spaces, which is to say completely, with their whole bodies and no reservation. "It's beautiful," he said. She looked at the drawing for a moment. "The materials they locked in the garage, I need to get those back. They're already in your studio. Sung-il had them moved this afternoon." She looked at him. Something crossed her face. Not surprise exactly, but the particular expression of a person receiving a practical kindness when they were braced for something more complicated. "Thank you," she said. "The storage unit will be keyed to your print," he said. "The household access codes will be reset. Everything in this estate has your authority attached to it, formally and in the record." He paused. "I should have done that when we got married." She looked back at the drawing. "Yes," she said. "You should have. Not softened, not forgiven around the edges. Just true." Said the way she said true things, which was directly and without drama. The way an architect marks a structural error on a drawing, not with accusation but with precision, because precision is the only thing that makes correction possible. "I'll do better," he said. She turned and looked at him. The garden light was low and the shadows under the maples were deep, and she looked at him in that light the way she had looked at him in the sublevel corridor that morning, without flinching from what she found, with the full attention of a person who has decided that the thing in front of them is worth looking at clearly. "I know you will," she said. Not a concession, not a performance of forgiveness, just a fact stated by a woman who knew the difference between what people were capable of and what they had so far done with that capability, and who had made a decision, somewhere in the long hours of the last 2 days, that those were not the same thing. The garden was quiet around them. The house above them, reduced now, clarified, the excess of it stripped away, was settling into its evening sounds. The kitchen staff moving toward the preparation of a dinner that would be smaller than last night's and considerably more honest. Hyejin's voice somewhere in the interior calling to a colleague about something routine and domestic. The sound of a house that has not forgotten what it went through today, but is choosing, in the way houses do, to keep functioning. The necklace was at Nia's throat. The locket sat in the hollow of her collarbone the way it always had, the way it had been designed to, the way her grandmother had worn it, and the way Nia wore it, and the way it had lain on a cold marble floor last night and been picked up by 2 different pairs of hands before finding its way back to where it belonged. Min-jae reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically, just took it, their hands on the stone bench between them, her fingers resting in his with the particular ease of a gesture that has been made many times and knows itself. "In 3 weeks," he said, "the gala is still scheduled." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I want to cancel it." She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" "Because the last time there was a room full of people and an event in this house." "Min-jae," she turned to him. "The gala is for the foundation. The grants it funds go to 8 organizations in this city. You cancel it because of what happened this morning, and those 8 organizations lose their annual support." She looked at him steadily. "We don't cancel the gala." He looked at her. "We go," she said, "together. We do the work the event is supposed to do. And the fact that we're standing there together, 3 weeks after what happened this morning, says something that canceling it never could." He studied her face, the certainty in it, the particular quality of a woman who has been through the last 36 hours and has emerged from them not diminished but clarified, stripped of the parts that were performance and left with the parts that were actually her, the structural core of a person who knows what she's made of because she's been tested against it. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They sat in the winter garden as the dark finished arriving over Seattle, the city lights doing their nightly work of making the dark beautiful instead of just dark. The glass ceiling held everything, the sky, the lights, the reflections of the maples, the 2 of them below it. In the weeks that followed the morning that changed the estate, things shifted in the way real things shift, not all at once, not cleanly, with the texture of genuine change, which is incremental and unglamorous, and sometimes takes 3 steps forward and 1 step back before it finds its new ground. The portraits in the main corridor, the lineage photographs, The formal family documentation of bloodline and succession came down by the end of the first week. Not in a dramatic removal, not in the kind of gesture that announces itself. Minjae did it on a Tuesday morning before the household was fully awake, carrying the frames himself to the storage room and replacing them with nothing at first, just the clean wall, the space that things had occupied before the things were there. Nia replaced them eventually. Not immediately, she waited until she knew what she wanted to put there, which was her way with spaces. She put up photographs of the people who had built things, the organization's early leadership, the men and women who had constructed what Minjae had inherited. People who appeared in the photos not in formal portraiture, but in the act of working. Some of them were young, some of them were laughing. All of them looked like people who had made something rather than inherited something, and the distinction was visible even in photographs. Hyejin stayed. She was given a formal promotion, a title change, a salary adjustment, a role that acknowledged what she had already been doing, which was managing the kitchen with the competence of someone twice her age, and the loyalty of someone who had made a decision about where to stand on the night when standing somewhere cost something. Sunhee remained in the estate. That was the part that surprised the captains most. They had expected removal, the clean excision of a compromised element. Minjae did not remove her. He sat with his mother twice a week in the east sitting room and they talked, the way he had promised, in the accumulation of smaller moments that were the only honest way to have the conversation they needed to have. It was not comfortable. Comfort was not the goal. The goal was true, and true was going to take longer than either of them initially wanted it to take, but neither of them stopped showing up to the twice-weekly conversations in the east room, and eventually the conversation started to have something in them that was worth having. Ju-young came back to the main estate after 5 months. She came back different, quieter, more careful in her watching, less quick to arrange herself around whoever held the most power in the room. Nia watched her make the adjustment over the weeks following her return and made no comment on it, which was its own form of grace. Hyunwoo's situation was resolved outside of public visibility. The financial recovery proceedings ran through Dong-hyun's office. The contractor and associated personnel were handled through channels that produced no legal record. The captains drew a line under the entire matter at a meeting in December that Minjae attended and spoke at briefly and did not speak about publicly afterward. The organization absorbed the loss and the disruption and continued functioning because organizations built on something real are more durable than the betrayals of people who believed they were more important to the structure than they were. The gala happened on the scheduled date. It was not the gala anyone had been imagining. The ballroom had been reconfigured, the layout changed, the security arrangement overhauled, the vendor credentials personally reviewed by Sung-il over 3 days in advance. The event happened the way events happen when everyone involved understands the weight of what they're doing, a little more carefully, a little more genuinely, with the particular quality of attention that follows difficulty. Nia wore a deep green dress. She wore the necklace. She stood at the entrance to the ballroom with Minjae, and she greeted 400 guests with the bearing of a woman who is entirely clear about whose house she's standing in, and the guests, the Seattle social world that watched the Kang Foundation, with the combination of admiration and wariness that powerful institutions tend to attract, saw something in her that they filed away and discussed later, a kind of settled authority that had nothing to do with the man beside her, that was hers independently and completely. Minjae gave a short speech. He thanked the foundation's partners. He announced the year's grant recipients. He said one thing that was not in the prepared remarks. He looked out at the room and said, quietly enough that the room had to go still to hear it, "This organization has always understood that what you build matters less than who you build it with. I'm learning that the same is true of everything else." He did not look at Nia when he said it. He didn't need to. The room understood. Later, when the gala had wound down and the guests had gone and the staff was clearing the ballroom in the subdued and efficient way that staff clears rooms after large events, Minjae and Nia walked through the estate's main corridor toward the east wing. Their footsteps were the only sound. The rest of the house was quiet, the kitchen dark, the portraits on the wall showing working people instead of bloodlines. At the entrance to the winter garden, Nia stopped. He stopped beside her. She was looking at the glass door, at the garden visible through it, the Japanese maples, the stone bench, the glass ceiling with whatever the November night was doing above it. She was looking at the corner. "I didn't know about the camera," she said. "I know," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Not angry, she had processed that part already, in the conversation upstairs and the accumulation of the weeks between. The camera was part of the fuller picture, the thing he had done before he understood what it would someday capture. The surveillance of a man who had spent his life watching for threats from outside and had placed his instruments accordingly. "What did I look like?" she said. He thought about it. About the blue-gray light of the security room, the monitor, the corner behind the maples, the woman with her knees up and the broken necklace in her palm, and the photograph of the house on South Wabash catching the ambient light of the garden. Like someone who had already decided, he said. She turned and looked at him. "Decided what?" she said. He looked back at her. "That you were going to be okay. Regardless." She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved through her face. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than happiness and more durable. The expression of a person hearing something that confirms something they already knew about themselves and is glad to have it confirmed from the outside. "I was," she said. She opened the garden door. They went inside together, into the warmth of the winter garden and the Japanese maples and the glass ceiling that held the November sky imperfectly, the way glass always does, true but not seamless. She sat on the stone bench and he sat beside her, and she opened her sketchbook to a new page and began to draw, and he sat with his coffee cooling in his hands and let the house be what it had become around them, quieter, cleaner, held together by something more durable than fear. Outside the estate's gates, the city went about its night. The streets were wet and the lights were doubled in the puddles on the pavement, and somewhere in Rainier Valley, a site had been cleared for a foundation to be poured in the spring, and the plans for what would stand on that foundation were in a sketchbook on a stone bench in a garden where a woman was drawing, and the drawing was good. The gate closed behind the last car leaving the gala. The estate was quiet. Not the quiet it had been before. The quiet of a house controlled by fear, where silence meant tension and stillness meant waiting. Something else. The quiet of a house that had been through the thing that tests houses and had come out the other side still standing, reconfigured, held differently than before but held. Minjae watched Nia draw and did not speak and did not need to. The necklace was at her throat, the locket was closed. The woman in the photograph inside it had never seen this house, had never known this man, had never held this particular version of her granddaughter's life in her hands. But she had given Nia something that had been present in every room of this estate across 36 hours of everything. The knowledge, worn close to the chest and returned to again and again like a touchstone, that you decide what you're made of before anyone tests it, and the testing only tells you if you were right. She had been right. They both had been, in the end, about the thing that mattered. That the person sitting beside you in the quiet after the storm is either the right person or they are not. And if they are, then the storm, all of it, the cost of it, the damage of it, the long work of what comes after it, was not a destruction but a foundation. And on foundations, if they're honest, you can build anything.